Before we dive into this story, hold your breath, because it smells like salt, sweat, and very poor life choices. Imagine a group of men so confident they thought the world was flat and still decided to risk falling off it. They carried Bibles, swords, and enough diseases to make a medieval pharmacist cry. This isn't just history, it's the original Boys Trip Gone Wrong, starring fever, gold, and existential regret. So grab your rum, say a quick prayer, and let's set sail into the chaos that built the modern world. Because nothing says civilization quite like a bunch of sunburned sailors accidentally reinventing disaster. The smell of salt and sweat mixed with something darker, an invisible perfume of sin and sickness that lingered in every harbor where Spanish ships anchored. The air trembled with songs, curses, and moans, a strange symphony born of conquest and loneliness. When those sailors came back from months at sea, they weren't just hungry for bread or wine, they were starving for touch. They stumbled through the alleys of Cadiz or Seville like ghosts in search of warmth, their pay clutched in shaking hands, ready to trade it for a few minutes of forgetting. The irony? They carried the New World's gold in their chests and the New World's disease in their veins. The ports of Spain at the height of its empire were worlds within worlds, floating theaters of temptation. Every ship that arrived from the Indies brought not only spices and silver, but stories. Stories of forbidden lands, naked gods, and pleasures unspoken in the confessional. And so, when night fell, the taverns filled with laughter and fever, with sailors boasting of conquests that sounded biblical and smelled contagious. They didn't know it then, but some of those encounters would echo through centuries, not in poems or songs, but in lesions, rashes, and children born deformed. History, it seems, has always had a twisted sense of humor. A sailor's life was short, violent, and punctuated by the illusion of control. They fought storms, mutinies, and pirates, yet the true enemy often waited behind a curtain in a dimly lit room. A woman with painted lips, a scent of cheap perfume, and eyes that had seen too many men die slowly. She smiled, not because she wanted to, but because hunger doesn't allow pride. Many of these women were forced into prostitution by poverty, widowed by war, or abandoned by the same kind of men they now served. They were both victims and executioners, unwilling carriers of a plague that no one dared name. It's easy to judge them from the comfort of modern medicine, where a pill can erase shame overnight. But imagine living in a time when every pleasure could be your last, when a kiss might condemn your soul and your skin. The sailors called it the fever of love. The priests called it God's punishment. And the doctors, well, they didn't call it anything at all. They simply experimented. If a cure burned your flesh or made your teeth fall out, so be it. At least you died purified. Humanity has always been creative when it comes to making suffering sound poetic. There's something tragically comic about the Spanish sailor swaggering into a brothel, declaring victory over oceans and empires, only to be defeated by a microscopic enemy invisible even to his god. He would boast to his friends about his night of passion, only to find, days later, a small sore blooming like a dark flower below his belt. The jokes would fade. The laughter would turn into fever. Some prayed. Others hid. But the infection traveled faster than confession could absolve. In the end, the church could forgive sins, but it couldn't heal pustules. And yet, for all their guilt and superstition, those men weren't just symbols of lust and punishment. They were human. Some wrote letters to their wives back home, sealing them with trembling hands, saying things like, "I caught a fever in Havana," never mentioning that the fever burned in shame as much as in flesh. Some begged the Virgin Mary to make their sores disappear. Others paid doctors who prescribed mercury, the cure that killed as often as it healed. You can almost hear the dark laughter of history again, the same element used in gold purification now melting the gums of men who sought purity of another kind. Ports were like breathing organisms, living, pulsating with sin, redemption, music, and decay. Every night, the same ritual unfolded. Ships docking, men stumbling ashore, the exchange of coins for touch, and the silent exchange of something far deadlier. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the rumors of the American disease, desire always won. Because desire has no memory. It forgets the pain the moment it feels the promise of relief. Maybe that's the cruelest part of human nature. We always think this time it'll be different, even when the wound is still fresh. By dawn, the horrors washed their sheets in seawater, hoping to cleanse away more than just stains. The sailors returned to their ships, thinking they had left the night behind. But the night traveled with them, sleeping under their skin, waiting. Some would reach the next port. Others would rot before sunrise. In the great story of the Spanish Empire, official history remembered the gold, the maps, the cathedrals, but not the bodies dissolving quietly in their hammocks. And maybe that's why the tale of these ports is so unsettling. It reveals the truth beneath the glory. The empire that conquered half the world couldn't conquer its own desires. There's a strange beauty in that contradiction. These men built the foundations of global trade, discovered continents, carried flags across oceans, and yet they couldn't control what happened between two sheets of linen. It's almost philosophical. We can sail to the edges of the earth, but not to the edges of our own impulses. And maybe, in the end, that's the real story. Not the disease, not the sin, but the absurd, tender, tragic comedy of being human. Because somewhere between the gold and the gonorrhea, between the prayers and the pus, between the empire and the infection, you find the truth of an age that no matter how much power a man holds, he will always be vulnerable to the things he desires most. And as the Spanish galleons departed carrying both glory and germs across the Atlantic, the world unknowingly began a new era, an empire not of land or faith but of contagion. And that, perhaps, is where the real voyage began. It started like a rumor, a whisper carried by the waves, a secret disease that followed the ships back from paradise. When Columbus's men returned from the New World, they brought home more than gold and exotic tales. They brought something invisible, something that laughed in the face of armor and prayer. No one knew its name yet, but it spread faster than gossip in a monastery. Soldiers called it the French disease. The French, insulted, called it the Spanish disease. The English, naturally, blamed everyone except themselves. And so the world's first great game of Knot-It began, with humanity pointing fingers while scratching the same sores. No one could imagine that the same voyage that mapped the unknown world would also redraw the map of the human body. The skin became a battlefield, the bones a graveyard of secrets. It was as if the New World had sent back a curse wrapped in lust, a punishment for the arrogance of explorers who thought they could steal continents and remain untouched. Some historians still argue whether the disease came from America or was simply waiting in Europe like a bad joke with perfect timing. Either way, it spread like wildfire through an empire built on desire and denial. In Seville, doctors wrote about men whose faces had turned into masks of decay. Lips dissolved, noses collapsed, skulls softened like wax under a candle. Yet in taverns, sailors still toasted to health, laughing with teeth that were already falling out. There's something perversely human about that, our ability to pretend everything's fine while we're literally rotting. It's the same spirit that makes people today post selfies in hospital gowns with the caption, "feeling blessed." The Spanish sailors did it without filters, just wine and denial was a powerful medicine. The church preached that disease was the price of sin, a heavenly invoice for earthly pleasure. So, the infected prayed harder, flagellated themselves, kissed relics, and begged saints whose marble faces never blinked. But faith doesn't kill bacteria. It just gives you something poetic to scream while it eats your flesh. The priests, terrified, started banning prostitutes from confessions because apparently even sins could be contagious. Imagine believing holiness could catch syphilis. Then again, superstition spreads faster than germs. Meanwhile, the empire's ships became floating laboratories of pain. The infected were forced to work until they dropped, coughing blood on the deck as the captain shouted about glory. The stench of infection mixed with tar and seawater. Some sailors begged to be thrown overboard. Others simply vanished one night, leaving only their hammocks swaying. You could almost hear the ocean whispering, "Another one for the depths." What the Spanish crown didn't realize was that their greatest export wasn't silver or sugar. It was suffering. In the brothels near the docks, the disease had its own rhythm, its own economy. A woman could charge extra if she promised she was clean, though no one really was. Some painted over their sores with powder and perfume. Others drank vinegar by the bottle, thinking it would kill the infection. It didn't, but it did make kissing them taste like salad. And still, the men came, drunk, desperate, convinced they were too brave, too lucky, too chosen by God to be undone by a woman's touch. But the disease had no interest in courage or faith. It treated kings and beggars the same. Doctors blessed their medieval hearts, decided mercury was the answer. "Sweat it out," they said, rubbing the poison into open wounds or making patients sit in steaming boxes until they fainted. If you didn't die of syphilis, you might die of the cure. It was a beautiful metaphor for humanity. We invent our own suffering, label it science, and call it progress. Mercury made the skin peel, the teeth fall, and the tongue swell, but it gave hope, and hope is harder to kill than bacteria. One curious physician in Barcelona tried a gentler approach. He prescribed music. He claimed the vibration of certain notes could drive out evil humors. Imagine an orchestra of dying men, moaning along to violins as their bones softened. The absurdity would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. And yet, that's exactly the thin line the Renaissance walked. A dance between genius and madness, reason and superstition, poetry and pus. The disease didn't discriminate. Nobles caught it from courtesans. Courtesans caught it from priests. Priests caught it from confessing sailors. The entire social pyramid was connected by the same invisible thread of infection. In Madrid, a bishop once excommunicated his own physician for suggesting he'd been infected through non-divine means. The poor doctor was burned for blasphemy. Ironically, fire might have been the only effective disinfectant of the time. Somewhere between the screams and prayers, an idea began to take root. Maybe this wasn't just punishment. Maybe it was a mirror. The Spanish elite began commissioning paintings of saints covered in wounds, believing the more grotesque the art, the more divine the message. but what they really painted was themselves, the infected soul of an empire pretending to be holy. Every blister became a metaphor, every ulcer a confession. You can't hide a rotten tooth behind a crown of gold forever. And yet, despite the horror, there was laughter. Humans always find it, even in decay. Tavern jokes about the pox became so common that sailors invented new slang for symptoms. A man losing his nose was called half-blessed. A woman with rashes was said to have danced with the angels. Grim humor kept them sane. It still does. In the end, what choice did they have? They were floating in an age of discovery and dying from what they discovered. The irony is that the same ships carrying maps of the stars were also carrying the disease that would humble the empires beneath them. Spain's sailors conquered oceans, but couldn't conquer their own blood. And as the infection spread across Europe, it carried with it something far more contagious than bacteria. The realization that pleasure always has a price. A cruel joke of nature, or perhaps just karma in microscopic form. By the time the empire realized what it had unleashed, it was too late. The disease had already written itself into the bloodstream of history, invisible but eternal. And from that moment, every voyage, every conquest, every kiss carried a question that no one dared to ask out loud. What if the true discovery of the New World wasn't the land, but the lesson? That no empire, no faith, no flag can protect a man from what he carries within himself. And that, in the end, might be the truest form of exploration, learning just how deep the human infection goes. They called them the daughters of the sea, though the sea never claimed them. The ocean only spat out men, broken, bruised, sunburned, and half-mad, while the women waited on land to finish the work the storms had started. In the ports of Spain, women became part of the machinery of empire, as necessary as sails or anchors. They soothed the sailors' fears, sold illusions by the hour, and carried on their bodies the hidden economy of infection. History remembers the admirals and conquistadors, but it forgets the women who turned their own skin into currency so that their families could eat. The irony? They were punished for surviving the only way the empire allowed them to. At night, the streets around the docks came alive with music that smelled of sweat and salt. Lanterns flickered like nervous hearts. Sailors staggered through alleys, guided by perfume and desperation. Women stood in doorways, painted smiles hiding the exhaustion of 1,000 encounters. Some were barely more than girls, others were veterans of love's battlefield, their laughter edged with bitterness and rum. They learned to read men like maps, each scar a story, each lie a direction. And yet, behind the painted faces and practiced seduction, most carried a quiet grief. They were both desired and despised, worshipped for an hour and cursed for eternity. The church tried to contain them, of course. Priests preached about fallen women while secretly visiting them after Mass. Confessionals became revolving doors of guilt. It was said that in Seville, prostitutes were required to confess weekly, though one priest complained that some sin faster than forgiveness can follow. Even sin had bureaucracy in Spain. The women went through this motions, reciting prayers by rote while the priest's eyes lingered too long. In a twisted way, confession became another form of foreplay, spiritual corruption disguised as repentance. If hypocrisy were contagious, Europe would have been quarantined. Doctors began noticing something strange. The same sores that sailors brought back from the New World started appearing on these women, then on their clients, and then on the wives of their clients. Disease didn't respect marriage vows. Suddenly, the moral decay of harlots had infected the upper class, and that terrified everyone. The nobility had always believed poverty was contagious. Now they discovered lust was too. Attempts to control it became absurd. In Cadiz, authorities set up purity houses, where women were examined by physicians before being allowed to work. Imagine medieval health inspections conducted by candlelight, men pretending to be doctors while ogling for God and country. It was theater, tragic, comic, and humiliating all at once. The women learned survival tricks that modern epidemiologists might envy. Some rubbed vinegar and ashes on their skin, others bathed in seawater at dawn. One legend tells of a woman nicknamed La Serena who swore she never got sick because she only kissed through a silk handkerchief. The men found it exotic, she found it profitable. Maybe she was the first to practice safe sin. It's funny how desperation breeds innovation. Humans invent condoms only after centuries of regret. La Serena eventually disappeared, but her legend lived on, whispered among women who dreamed of control in a world that gave them none. While men carried the disease across oceans, women carried its shame. Society blamed them for spreading it, never mind that it was the sailors who arrived infected in the first place. It's a pattern that never really died. When something goes wrong, blame the woman. Eve, Pandora, the prostitute of Cadiz. It's always easier to condemn the hand that feeds you than the hunger that drives you. And yet, amid the cruelty, there were moments of strange tenderness. Some sailors returned to the same woman every voyage, treating her like an anchor in a world of storms. They brought small gifts, coral bracelets, rosaries, pieces of glass from faraway shores. Love, or something close to it, bloomed in the shadow of disease. But love was dangerous. A woman could catch the fever after one night and carry it until her bones sang with pain. Many didn't make it past 30. The lucky ones learned to fake their deaths and move inland, starting new lives as laundresses or midwives. Those who stayed often turned to the church, trading one form of service for another. The convents filled with women whose vows were less about faith than about survival. Some prayed for redemption, others just wanted rest. Behind the heavy stone walls, they treated each other's sores with herbs and whispered jokes about men who thought holiness could hide a rash. Even pain can be funny when you've lived enough of it. Outside those walls, the ports kept humming as if nothing had changed. Ships came and went carrying gold and germs in equal measure. The sailors told tales of angels seen at sea and demons seen in bed. They boasted that Spanish blood was too pure to rot, an optimism disproved daily. Doctors still swore by mercury, which meant the women could recognize a poisoned man by the way his gums shimmered like silver. Some joked that Spain was turning into one big alchemical experiment. Mix lust, poverty, and ignorance, and see what explodes first. And yet, life went on. The laughter returned to the taverns, the music to the docks, the same rituals repeating every night as if humanity itself were trapped in a fever dream. A sailor would arrive, pockets jingling, heart pounding, looking for warmth. A woman would open her door, hiding her pain behind a smile. They would make their brief transaction of illusion, each pretending not to see what the other was hiding. And somewhere, between the moans and the prayers, the disease would find a new home. Perhaps the cruelest truth of all is how ordinary it became. The empire normalized infection the way we normalize stress or heartbreak today, just part of living. And maybe that's the dark comfort of history, realizing that every generation has its own version of the same wound. We keep repeating the dance, convinced that desire can be controlled, that consequences can be outsmarted. But the ports of Spain whispered a different lesson, one that still echoes across centuries. You can quarantine a body, but never a need. And so the sailors kept returning, and the women kept waiting, and the empire kept pretending it was immortal. The sea didn't care. It simply watched, patient as always, erasing footprints and swallowing secrets, knowing that nothing man builds, not his ships, not his pride, not even his sins, can stay afloat forever. They said the cure was worse than the curse, and for once, everyone agreed. Picture a dim room smelling of herbs, sweat, and fear. A man sits trembling on a wooden stool, his skin blistered, his eyes sunken. The doctor, a title that meant guy with confidence and tools, approaches with a bowl of shimmering silver liquid. Mercury, the element of transformation, the alchemist's dream, the sailor's nightmare. The treatment was simple. Rub it on your skin, inhale its vapors, or swallow enough to make your tongue feel like molten metal. If you didn't die, congratulations, you were healed. Humanity has always had a remarkable ability to confuse torture with therapy. Mercury became the Spanish Empire's favorite poison. Doctors prescribed it with the enthusiasm of a child discovering fire, and with about the same sense of caution. They called it cura per sudorum, the cure through sweating. The patient was locked in a small wooden box, like a confession booth designed by a sadist, while hot mercury fumes filled the air. The logic was simple. If the disease was evil, it could be sweated out. The problem was that the evil often left along with the patient's sanity, teeth, and will to live. When your gums turned black and your jawbone loosened, the doctor would proudly declare, "The treatment is working." Nothing says progress like death with enthusiasm. There was also a popular saying among sailors, "Una noche con placer, un año con mercurio." 1 night of pleasure, 1 year of mercury. The empire had found a strange symmetry between sin and suffering. Even the church approved. What better proof of divine punishment than a medicine that burned like hell? Some priests would sprinkle holy water on the patients before treatment, as if blessing a roast before it entered the oven. Faith and science may have disagreed on many things, but both loved a bit of spectacle. Then came the unguento divino, the divine ointment, a mix of mercury, animal fat, and ashes, applied directly to the sores. If you can imagine rubbing poison and lard into an open wound, you're halfway to understanding 16th century medicine. The smell alone could send a man into delirium, but people lined up for it, desperate for salvation. Some said they could feel the disease screaming as the ointment burned. More likely, that was just their nervous system giving up. Still, they believed. Humans always do. We'd rather die with hope than live with uncertainty. Of course, the rich had their own version of the cure. Instead of sweating in wooden boxes, they bathed in mercury-laced milk or took silver pills shaped like stars. They called it refined healing. Translation, dying with style. The poor were lucky if they got a spoonful of vinegar and a prayer. But the disease was democratic. It didn't care if you wore rags or silk. The sores bloomed just the same, like ugly little reminders that nature doesn't read titles. One doctor, Alonso de Morales, tried to modernize things. He mixed mercury with wine and prescribed it as a drink for the soul and the body. It sold surprisingly well. People have always trusted alcohol to fix their problems. But when his patients began hallucinating serpents and angels, Morales claimed the visions were part of the purification process. He wasn't entirely wrong. Mercury does make you see things that aren't there. Today we call that poisoning. Back then, it was enlightenment. Some healers, mostly women, turned to plants instead. They used rosemary, garlic, and crushed coral to make salves that at least smelled better. Many were branded as witches for their trouble. It's funny, isn't it? The men who melted people with mercury were called doctors. The women who used herbs were burned as heretics. History has always had a gender bias, even in its lunacy. One midwife in Valencia supposedly cured dozens using nothing but olive oil and patience. Naturally, she was arrested. The Inquisition never liked competition. In the port towns, charlatans thrived. Traveling healers promised miracle cures made of powdered pearls or snake hearts. One man sold dried toad skin as an aphrodisiac and anti-syphilitic. Talk about mixed messages. These quacks became early marketers, selling hope in bottles with slogans like, "Restores your vigor and your virtue." It worked because people wanted to believe that redemption could be swallowed. The truth, though, was that the disease never really left. It just hid, waiting to remind you of your sins later. The grotesque theater of medicine reached its peak in the royal courts. When a nobleman fell ill, doctors would debate whether to bleed him, poison him, or pray for him first. The king's physicians often wore silk gloves and perfume to mask the stench of their art. They measured their success not in lives saved, but in how long they could postpone the inevitable. One chronicler wrote that after each failed treatment, they would hold banquets to celebrate divine mystery. Imagine dying while your doctors toast your endurance. It's both tragic and hilariously human. Somewhere in all that madness, the idea of the beautiful suffering emerged. Pain became proof of faith, illness a badge of honor. Paintings began to show saints covered in sores that resembled syphilitic lesions. The public saw them as martyrs, not patients. People prayed to Saint Thomas Roche, patron saint of plague victims, hoping he'd understand their private agony. It was as if the whole continent agreed that beauty could bloom from decay, as long as the decay was someone else's. And yet, amid the cruelty and ignorance, there were glimpses of progress. Doctors began writing detailed case studies, trying to understand what exactly was destroying their patients. Some realized that mercury didn't kill the disease, it just silenced it temporarily. Others started experimenting with diet, hygiene, and rest. Tiny steps, fragile and slow, but steps nonetheless. The empire that had conquered half the world was now learning to wash its hands. There's a strange lesson buried in this history. Every age has its mercury, its miracle that turns out to be poison. We laugh at the past, but we still drink from the same well, believing in shortcuts, trusting authority, calling pain healing because it feels noble. The sailors of Spain were burned and broken by their cures, but at least they believed they were fighting for life. Today, we just swallow pills and hope for side effects that come with good marketing. Maybe the only thing that's really changed is the packaging. And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the ghosts of those old apothecaries whispering, "The cure is working." Maybe it is. Maybe it always has been. But the question that still lingers, centuries later across time and skin, is whether we've ever really learned to tell the difference between being healed and being destroyed. By the time the Spanish Empire stretched across oceans, disease had already become one of its most loyal passengers. The ships that carried saints and soldiers also carried something far more democratic, microbes that respected no rank or prayer. Every time a fleet left Cadiz or Cartagena, it wasn't just gold and gunpowder that filled the hulls. It was fever sealed in flesh, trembling inside the blood of men who thought themselves immortal. The irony was brutal. They brought salvation to the New World and damnation to the Old, sometimes in the same breath. When those sailors reached the colonies, they stepped onto land as walking contradictions, heroes of empire and vectors of contagion. Villages that had never seen a cross or cannon now saw blisters blooming on their own people. The Spanish crown liked to talk about spreading the word of God, but what spread faster was the word of pain. One missionary wrote that sin travels quicker than ships, though he didn't realize he was describing the first global pandemic of desire. And while priests baptized natives in rivers, sailors were baptizing them in something far less holy. Empires are built on trade, and disease has always been the most efficient currency. On board, the conditions were perfect for infection. Imagine 100 men packed into a wooden coffin that floated. The air below deck was thick enough to chew, filled with salt, vomit, and prayers that smelled like fear. A single cough could turn a voyage into a plague. And yet, the sailors joked about it. "Better die at sea than live without rum," they'd say, which sounds brave until you realize they meant it. One surgeon noted that sailors' sores flowered like stars in the dark, a poetic way of saying their skin was disintegrating. That's the strange beauty of history. It's full of people dying beautifully. Back home, the Spanish court was growing paranoid. Every returning ship was greeted like a celebrity and inspected like a corpse. Authorities began quarantining entire harbors, turning cities into open-air prisons. The ports became ghost towns, taverns empty, music gone, only the creak of ropes and the hiss of tides. Merchants complained that God was bad for business. Priests insisted it was the devil. The truth was simpler. The empire had built a perfect system for exporting both wealth and infection. Globalization, centuries before anyone gave it a name. What made it worse was that the disease didn't discriminate. From beggars to bishops, from sailors to queens, it spread like gossip, fast, juicy, and impossible to contain. There are letters from Spanish nuns describing the holy afflictions of noble ladies whose faces were eaten away, yet whose husbands swore they were struck by divine light. The polite word for it was melancholia. The less polite word was syphilis. When your face is falling off, melancholia sounds almost romantic. Some soldiers believed they could cleanse themselves through battle. They said every wound bled out the sickness, which was a convenient excuse to keep fighting. Others turned to pilgrimages, roads to Santiago filled with limping men and weeping women, dragging their bodies toward forgiveness. Along the way, they left traces of infection in every village they touched. Faith and fever moved in tandem, one feeding the other. It's almost poetic how religion and disease share the same strategy. Spread, convert, repeat. The church began calling the epidemic God's mirror. Well, to them, the sores were proof of divine justice, a visible map of hidden sins. But if that were true, Spain should have been glowing like a lantern. Still, sermons thundered that the plague had come to humble the empire's pride. And maybe, in a dark way, it worked. The same nation that once believed it ruled by divine right now watched its kings rot from the same disease as peasants. That's equality, delivered by infection. In the colonies, the situation was even crueler. The Spanish settlers, already weakened by their own illnesses, carried them to indigenous populations whose immune systems had never seen such horrors. Entire tribes vanished in a generation. The conquerors called it the will of God. The victims called it what it was, hell. Imagine the confusion of people who'd never seen a European before, now watching their skin erupt after touching one. That's not divine punishment, that's biological warfare with a rosary. Doctors in the New World wrote desperate letters back to Spain, describing how the disease burned through the natives like dry grass. Some suggested separating the infected, others suggested prayer, and a few recommended mercy through fire, which was a poetic way of saying burn the sick. When logic fails, fear fills the gap. The Spanish Empire was terrified of its own reflection, an empire of believers undone by its own flesh. And yet, through it all, trade never stopped. Gold and silver kept flowing, carrying infection in their shadow. Ships docked, unloaded treasure, and left with more sailors than they arrived with, thanks to the brothels that had become unofficial embassies of empire. The women there were both gatekeepers and gravediggers of global commerce. A single night in Havana could infect a dozen men who'd soon be in Lisbon, Venice, or Antwerp. The disease didn't need ships anymore. It had found its own ocean. Blood. What's fascinating, almost darkly comic, is that while the empire was collapsing from within, its propaganda was stronger than ever. Paintings showed golden saints and pure-faced explorers, not the toothless sailors or the courtesans with sores hidden under lace. The Spanish crown demanded portraits that looked healthy, even if the subjects weren't. There's a portrait of Philip II where his right hand covers his mouth, a subtle way to hide the lesions. Vanity, it seems, survives, even when the body doesn't. Eventually, the disease became part of daily life, like sin, death, and taxes. Apothecaries sold tonics promising health, virility, and the forgiveness of God. Quacks grew rich while physicians grew hopeless. And through it all, the ports kept breathing, wheezing, and spreading. The empire tried to legislate morality to control the uncontrollable. But you can't quarantine human desire. Every sailor who left a port carried a piece of the empire with him, a reminder that conquest is never clean. Centuries later, when historians tried to trace the map of the Spanish Empire, they found two parallel routes, one of gold, one of disease. Both glittered, both destroyed. The same winds that filled the sails also carried the whispers of the dying. And maybe that's the truest symbol of the age. Not the cross, not the crown, but the cough of a sailor echoing across an ocean. Because in the end, the Spanish didn't just conquer new worlds, they infected them just as they infected themselves. The empire became a metaphor for the human condition, glorious, diseased, and desperately in denial. And as the sun set on Spain's golden age, one could almost imagine the sea laughing softly, watching men who thought they could own the world, only to discover they couldn't even own their own bodies. The ships sailed home with less gold than they left with, but more stories than history could bear to tell. And somewhere between the prayers, the pride, and the plague, the empire learned its most painful lesson, that power, like disease, always spreads faster than wisdom. They used to say that the sea kept secrets, but it never kept letters. The ink faded, the paper crumbled, but the words survived, preserved in archives, whispered in time like confessions trapped in glass. Sailors wrote from ports that smelled of sweat and salt, their hands trembling not from storms but from fever. Some wrote to wives, others to mothers, and a few to women who had already forgotten their names. The letters were full of apologies, lies, and strange poetry. The ocean is calm tonight, but my skin burns like hell. They didn't know what they were dying from, only that it started with pleasure and ended with rot. There's something profoundly human about that, our ability to turn tragedy into poetry, even when our bones are dissolving. One letter found in Seville's archives tells of a man named Esteban, a sailor who wrote to his wife after years at sea. He said he had a rash from the New World, as if it were a souvenir. He promised her gold, a small house, and eternal love, but by the end of the page, his handwriting slipped into madness. I dream of fire inside my veins, he wrote, and the smell of death feels like home. His ship never returned. Some say he was buried at sea, others that he was thrown overboard when the captain realized the infection was spreading. The ocean doesn't care about promises. It swallows them with the same indifference it swallows men. Doctors kept diaries too, though theirs were written not out of love, but fear. They described patients whose tongues turned black, whose noses vanished overnight. One doctor wrote, "The disease consumes the flesh as if jealous of the soul." Another noted how mercury seemed to quiet the symptoms just long enough for the patients to believe they'd been saved. Then the fever returned, stronger, mocking them. Reading those notes today feels like eavesdropping on desperation disguised as science. We call it progress, but back then it was just educated guessing with a death toll. And then there were the letters from priests, the most tragic and ironic of all. They wrote of sailors who begged for absolution with their last breath, confessing sins they could no longer remember. One priest in Havana described how he sprinkled holy water on a dying man's sores, convinced the disease was a demon. He screamed as if purged by fire, the priest wrote, and then smiled before dying. Maybe he mistook agony for grace. Religion and infection often blurred into one. Both demanded surrender, both promised peace. Whether you got it was another story. Sometimes the letters weren't even written. They were spoken, dictated to whoever still had the strength to hold a pen. Dying men would whisper confessions to shipmates who scribbled them down between vomiting fits. "Tell my son not to become a sailor," one wrote. "The sea rewards the brave with worms." Dark humor was the only medicine they could afford. It's strange how laughter survives where logic fails. Maybe that's humanity's real immune system, the ability to laugh while dying. Back on land, those letters often arrived months or years after the men who wrote them were gone. Imagine a woman in Toledo opening a letter from her husband only to realize she's reading his ghost. Some burned them immediately, fearing they carried disease. Others kept them hidden, wrapped in cloth, touching them like relics. The ink, faded and fragile, became the last trace of touch they'd ever receive. The Spanish Empire may have ruled the world, but it could never conquer distance. The sea was both bridge and grave. There were also letters from doctors to the crown, begging for funds to build hospitals for infected sailors. Most were ignored. The empire preferred to spend money on ships, not the men who died in them. One physician complained that the gold of the Indies shines brighter than the suffering of its carriers. A perfect summary of imperial priorities. Wealth first, flesh later, preferably buried. And so the hospitals that did exist became hellish places where patients were chained to prevent escape. One visiting monk wrote that the stench of sin was unbearable. He meant the smell of rotting men. Funny how piety can sanitize cruelty with a few choice words. Among the letters were also strange, almost tender exchanges between sailors themselves. Men who'd shared the same hammocks and bottles, now sharing a disease that linked them closer than brotherhood. One man wrote to another, "If I die first, keep my knife. It cuts well and has never failed me. Maybe it will cut through what we've done." It's heartbreaking and absurd at the same time, trying to carve meaning out of decay. As time went on, these letters became evidence in trials. The church used them to accuse people of moral corruption. Doctors used them to prove theories about contagion. They stopped being human voices and became data. The empire, ever practical, even started censoring them, burning anything that mentioned the American plague. History loves to erase its embarrassing rashes. But you can still find them, those scraps of shame, buried in dusty archives like fossils of desire. Each one smells faintly of ink, salt, and guilt. What's most fascinating is how similar these letters sound to the ones written centuries later, from soldiers in trenches, from prisoners, from lovers separated by pandemics. Different wars, same disease, loneliness. We keep writing to people who can't save us, as if words could cure what the body can't. Maybe that's why the sailors kept writing even as their hands trembled. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about staying human while everything else turned to rot. And somewhere between those fading lines, you realize something strange. That even in agony, people reach for beauty. A dying sailor describes the sea as blue as forgiveness. A prostitute writes that men die quickly, but their lies live longer. A doctor confesses that every patient I lose feels like a confession I cannot finish. These fragments, scattered across centuries, become a kind of accidental poetry, a chorus of regret humming beneath the empire's golden hymns. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them. The The scratching of quills on parchment, the moaning of waves outside, the whispered prayers of men who wanted to be remembered as more than their disease. The letters never cured anyone, but they did something medicine couldn't. They gave meaning to the madness. And maybe that's the only cure we ever really have, to turn pain into story, shame into ink, and silence into something that refuses to die. Because long after the bodies dissolved and the ships sank, those words still float, ghosts on paper, proof that even when the flesh betrays us, the voice tries stubbornly to survive. The Spanish Empire liked to think of itself as eternal, a divine machine powered by faith, gold, and conquest. But even eternal machines rust. Beneath the banners and hymns, its gears were grinding, clogged with something it couldn't control. Disease, exhaustion, and a kind of invisible sadness that spread faster than any plague. You could feel it in the air of the ports, in the whispers of the soldiers, even in the way priests crossed themselves a little slower than before, as if they weren't entirely sure which side God was on anymore. The empire that had once swallowed continents now seemed to be choking on its own reflection. The truth was that expansion had a cost that no one had calculated. Every voyage meant hundreds of bodies packed into wooden coffins disguised as ships, carrying not only spices and silver, but the smell of decay. The Atlantic became a graveyard, and the Pacific, a rumor. Men died before they even saw land, their corpses wrapped in canvas and tossed into the waves, where sharks followed Spanish galleons like loyal dogs. They said the sharks learned to recognize the sound of church bells ringing from the deck. It meant lunch. Funny how nature adapts faster than humans do. Still, they kept sailing. Greed has no memory. The conquistadors brought back stories of lands flowing with gold, but what they didn't mention were the fevers, the rashes, the bones that cracked like porcelain. Every chest of treasure came with a coffin's worth of sickness. Some joked that the gold was cursed. Others said it was holy punishment. The more cynical ones said it was just life, which might be the most accurate answer of all. Spain called it glory. The rest of the world called it contamination. On land, the empire's soldiers became carriers of more than muskets. They left behind towns where the brothels outnumbered the churches, where entire populations fell ill within weeks. In the Philippines, sailors bragged of baptizing the locals and then sleeping with them in the same night. First God, then pleasure, one wrote. In that order, if I remember correctly. Colonial morality was flexible, to put it politely. The empire preached virtue by day and bought sin by night, exporting guilt as efficiently as silver. It wasn't just the soldiers, of course. Missionaries carried infection with their crosses, noblemen brought it to courts wrapped in silk, and merchants spread it with every handshake. Even the king's own physicians knew that half the royal bloodline was riddled with what they called el mal divino, the divine sickness. Of course, no one said it out loud. Spain was too proud to admit that its veins were rotting. Instead, they built more cathedrals, as if stone could outlast bacteria. It's funny how humans try to build immortality out of bricks when their own bodies are busy falling apart. Every empire has its moment of denial, and for Spain, that denial was gilded. The Inquisition burned heretics while ignoring the fact that its own inquisitors were dying of the same unholy fever they condemned in others. Doctors prescribed confession. Priests prescribed mercury, and neither worked. One chronicler wrote that the devil hides in the blood, and maybe he was right. The empire's bloodstream was poisoned, with disease, with greed, with hypocrisy. The line between sin and symptom blurred until no one could tell which was which. In the Americas, the sickness took a different shape. The indigenous people called it the white man's fire, a slow burn that never went out. Entire villages vanished without a single battle being fought. The Spanish built chapels over their graves and called it salvation. It was an empire of contradictions, spreading the word of a merciful God through the most merciless means imaginable. And yet, even as death followed them, the conquistadors kept writing home about paradise. Maybe they really believed it, or maybe they just couldn't admit that they'd turned heaven into hell and called it progress. The strangest part was how ordinary it all became. Disease became routine, like paying taxes or going to confession. People joked about it in taverns. Sailors invented songs about their sores. Prostitutes advertised themselves as tested by fire, which, disturbingly, meant exactly what it sounded like. The empire's glory was built on a culture that had learned to romanticize pain. They made suffering sound noble and nobility sound contagious. When a soldier returned home with scars, people called them marks of honor. No one asked what kind of honor burns. Art followed suit. Painters began depicting saints covered in wounds, their expression serene, their flesh decaying beautifully. The line between holiness and infection vanished. The same people who feared disease also worshipped it, painting it into halos and hymns. It's as if Spain collectively decided that if it couldn't cure the sickness, it might as well canonize it. And in a way it worked. Centuries later, people still visit those paintings and call them miracles, not realizing they're looking at portraits of despair disguised as faith. Even the poets got in on the act. They wrote sonnets comparing love to leprosy, desire to plague, heartbreak to It wasn't metaphor, it was autobiography. One famous writer compared his mistress's beauty to a fever that purifies. Either he was a genius or he was delirious from mercury treatment. Probably both. Spanish literature of the time reads like a love letter written by someone who knows the kiss might kill him and decides it's worth it anyway. That's the kind of madness empires are built on. By the late 1600s, the sickness had become part of Spain's identity. It was whispered about in courts, joked about in taverns, feared in bedrooms. Children were born infected, proof that sin could be inherited as easily as wealth. The empire's doctors began to realize that the disease wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Whole generations grew up believing pain was proof of purity. The more you suffered, the closer you were to God. It's no wonder Spain became obsessed with martyrdom. When the body becomes a battlefield, you might as well make the wounds holy. And so the empire limped on, bleeding quietly beneath its armor of gold. It conquered and converted, built and burned, until one day it simply started to fade. Not with an explosion, but with a sigh. The disease didn't destroy it directly, it just drained its strength, its will, its illusion of divine immunity. History likes to blame economics, wars, politics. But maybe the empire didn't fall because of what it did wrong. It fell because it refused to admit it was human. Because it believed itself untouchable, even while it was scratching its sores under silk sleeves. In the end, Spain's greatest export wasn't gold, or language, or faith. It was a lesson. That power is fragile, that glory decays, that every empire, no matter how holy it believes itself to be, eventually has to face the mirror and see the rot beneath the crown. And maybe that's the only cure there ever was. Not mercury, not prayer, but honesty. The moment when you stop pretending the wound is divine and finally admit, it's just a wound. They thought they were discovering the world, but what they were really discovering was themselves, one autopsy at a time. Somewhere between the gold and the glory, between the ships and the sermons, a quiet revolution was beginning. Men in blood-stained coats, leaning over corpses, trying to make sense of what sin had done to the body. The Spanish Empire had been built on the promise of divine order, but the human body refused to obey divine logic. It leaked, it rotted, it betrayed. And so the doctors, half scientists and half priests of flesh, started asking dangerous questions. What if the disease wasn't punishment, but simply biology? It was heresy to even think it. The church preached that every sore was a moral scar, a message from heaven to behave better next time. But some curious minds weren't satisfied with that explanation. They wanted to know why the sores appeared in the same places, why the blood thickened, why the brain burned with fever and madness. They didn't find divine wrath under the skin. They found nerves, tissue, vessels, and something far more frightening, proof that nature doesn't care about good or evil. It just exists. Imagine the shock of realizing that your damnation might simply be chemistry. The first autopsies were performed in secret by candlelight. They dissected the bodies of sailors who had died of the great pox, cutting carefully through skin that still bore the stigmata of desire. The notes they kept were half scientific, half poetic. The heart blackens like ink spilled upon parchment. They were terrified and fascinated at the same time, as if each corpse were a forbidden book that might rewrite scripture. In one report, a surgeon named Rodrigo de Herrera described finding a strange softness in the bones, as though God himself had melted them. He wasn't wrong. Syphilis eats you from the inside out. Of course, the church found out, and because the church had a gift for irony, it accused these doctors of playing God, even though their only sin was trying to understand his design. One was excommunicated for cutting into divine mystery. Another was burned alongside his notes. That's how Spain handled innovation, with fire and confession. Still, the curiosity couldn't be killed. Knowledge has this annoying habit of surviving censorship. By the mid-1500s, whispers of anatomy were spreading across Europe. Students from Spain sneaked into Italian universities, where the likes of Vesalius were redefining medicine. They returned home with new ideas and fewer illusions. Suddenly, diseases had patterns, symptoms had causes, pain had anatomy, and yet the moral question remained. If the body is just a machine, where does the soul fit in? One doctor joked that he had looked everywhere for it, heart, brain, liver, but perhaps it hides in the taxes. Science was growing teeth, and humor was its first line of defense. Mercury, the old favorite of Spanish medicine, began losing its shine. Physicians started experimenting with diet, rest, and herbs. Scandalous, really, to think that oranges might succeed where prayer had failed. Hospitals began organizing patients by symptoms instead of sins. Some even introduced a radical concept called fresh air. It was revolutionary stuff. Of course, these doctors were still centuries away from germ theory, but they were learning one uncomfortable truth. Most suffering wasn't divine punishment. It was human negligence. The empire had created perfect conditions for disease and then blamed God for the results. And yet, even as science advanced, superstition clung on like mold on damp walls. Barbers still sold potions made from crushed emeralds. Widows burned rosemary to ward off lustful spirits. In one Madrid tavern, a merchant advertised purified air in glass jars. Customers bought it, of course. Hope sells better than truth. It always has. Humans will believe anything as long as it comes in fancy packaging. Even today, we still buy our own versions of bottled miracles. The only difference is that now they come with barcodes. But something deeper began shifting: how people saw their bodies. For centuries, the body had been a prison of the soul, a filthy vessel destined to decay. Now, thanks to those forbidden dissections, it was becoming a map, a code, a landscape of mystery that could be studied, named, controlled. You can almost feel the psychological shift, the slow, terrifying birth of modern identity. People began to realize that their bodies weren't just gifts from God or tools of sin, they were themselves. And once you make that discovery, you can never go back to blind faith. In the courts and palaces, this new awareness produced an odd kind of vanity. Nobles commissioned paintings not just of their faces, but of their diseases, as if trying to prove that even corruption could be beautiful if painted in enough gold. Doctors began to appear in portraits too, standing proudly with surgical instruments that looked more like torture devices. It was fashioned to be treated, even if the treatment killed you. Pain became a status symbol. One aristocrat bragged that he had survived 7 purges and 5 bleedings in 1 week. The modern equivalent would be someone posting about their detox cleanse. Same delusion, better marketing. Still, progress was progress. Medical books multiplied. Artists studied cadavers to paint the body with terrifying accuracy. Even the word venereal, from Venus, the goddess of love, was coined around this time, turning desire itself into pathology. That was the final twist of irony. The same passion that inspired poetry and exploration was now being studied under a microscope. Love became a disease you could diagram, and so the empire's legacy began to shift from conquest to curiosity. Spain had exported infection. Now it was importing knowledge. The old world that once believed in curses now began to believe in causes. The doctor replaced the priest, the scalpel replaced the sermon. And yet, nothing really changed where it mattered most. People still kept sinning, still kept falling in love, still kept dying for it. Maybe that's the one disease humanity will never cure, the belief that we can separate desire from its consequences. Somewhere in Seville, under the shadow of a cathedral that once banned autopsies, a group of young physicians gathered to study a body by candlelight. The flickering light made the corpse seem alive, like it might wake at any moment. One of them whispered, "We're trespassing against God." The other replied, "Then let him take notes." That's how it always begins, the defiance of curiosity, and from that defiance came everything we now call modern science, born not from purity but from plague. It's strange, isn't it? The same empire that once spread death across oceans also gave birth to the tools that would one day save lives. History loves irony like that. The Spanish ships carried both destruction and discovery. Their legacy was written in both blood and ink. The disease that had humiliated kings became the catalyst for understanding the human body itself. From the sores of sailors came the seeds of science. And maybe that's the most human thing of all, to turn our disasters into lessons, our pain into progress, our rot into reason. Because no matter how deep the wound, curiosity always finds a way to dig deeper. The sickness didn't just scar bodies, it started to paint souls. Artists, desperate to understand what words could not confess, began turning infection into metaphor. Suddenly, every brushstroke seemed to whisper about pain, temptation, and decay. The Spanish painters of the Golden Age were surrounded by a world where flesh and faith were constantly at war, and you could feel it in their art. Their saints looked exhausted, their martyrs strangely serene, their angels pale enough to make you wonder if they, too, had been touched by disease. Even holiness looked contagious. The painters didn't have to look far for inspiration. In every port, in every street, there were faces collapsing quietly, like candles melting before dawn. The same sores that terrified doctors fascinated artists. They saw something almost divine in suffering. The way light clung to damaged skin, how agony could make a man's eyes shine brighter than life ever had. It was beauty through decay, faith through rot. One critic later wrote that Spanish art learned to find God in the wound. Maybe that's the truest definition of beauty in that era. Not perfection, but survival. Murillo painted beggars with the tenderness of saints, Velázquez gave deformity dignity, and Zurbaran's monks stared into the void as if they'd been told the truth and regretted asking. Every painting was a confession disguised as devotion. Even when they painted Christ, it was as if they were painting themselves, bleeding, bruised, too proud to stop believing. You can almost imagine the artist whispering to their models, "Hold still, you're not dying, you're being immortalized." That's the kind of dark humor Spain specialized in, dying beautifully so no one would notice the smell. And yet, art wasn't just a mirror, it was an antidote. People who couldn't afford medicine could still afford to stare at paintings. There was comfort in seeing their pain made holy. A poor woman coughing in a cathedral might look up and think, "At least my suffering looks good in oil." That's how the empire worked, transforming misery into myth, infection into iconography. It was emotional alchemy, and it sold well. Even the church understood the marketing potential of agony. Meanwhile, poets were doing their own kind of surgery. They carved words instead of flesh, dissecting the human condition with rhyme and irony. Lope de Vega wrote about love like it was a fever that no prayer could cool. Quevedo joked about his rotting teeth as if decay were a badge of honor. My mouth, he wrote, is a graveyard of passion. Imagine turning gum disease into art. That's talent. Spain had perfected the art of self-pity so well that it became poetry. Theater followed suit. Audiences packed into smoky halls to watch plays about lust, betrayal, and divine punishment. The actors, sweating under candlelight, performed morality tales that looked suspiciously like confession disguised as entertainment. There's a rumor that one famous actor collapsed mid-scene during a play about redemption, and the audience thought it was part of the show. Maybe it was. In Spain, death was always theater. Music too began to change. Church choirs sang slower, sadder. The triumphant hymns of conquest gave way to laments. The melodies carried both prayer and regret, often indistinguishable from one another. In some cathedrals, they said the echo of voices sounded like weeping, as if the walls themselves were mourning. People didn't realize it, but they were composing the soundtrack of an empire in decline. The disease had moved from the blood into the collective imagination. Even fashion caught the fever. The court of Philip II, dressed in black, claiming it was for modesty, but everyone knew it was also for mourning beauty, youth, and probably common sense. The stiff collars and heavy fabrics made people look like walking funerals. Imagine trying to flirt while wearing 40 pounds of sorrow. And yet, they did. Because the Spanish, even when dying, refused to give up on style. They turned death into couture. Writers began to romanticize suffering as a sign of depth. Pain became intellectual. If you were cheerful, people assumed you were shallow. He who laughs has learned nothing, one philosopher declared, an early prototype for that one friend who insists on explaining Nietzsche at parties. Melancholy became fashionable. You weren't sick, you were sensitive, you weren't dying, you were transcending. Spain invented emo centuries before eyeliner, and the painters followed the mood. The chiaroscuro style, those deep contrasts between light and darkness, wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a psychological one. Light was fleeting, fragile, divine. Darkness was truth. Viewers would stand before a painting and feel seen, not by God, but by their own mortality. There's something oddly comforting about that. When the world feels unstable, at least death is consistent. But under all that beauty, something else was happening. A subtle shift from religion to reflection. The same people who once feared to question God were now questioning themselves. Why does pleasure lead to pain? Why does purity require suffering? Why does everything beautiful decay? They didn't have the language of psychology yet, but they were feeling their way toward it through brush and pen. The disease had infected the mind, and the mind responded by creating philosophy. The Spanish Golden Age was less golden than gilded, shining on the surface, rotting underneath. The irony is that all this decay produced some of the most enduring art in human history. The very empire that was collapsing gave birth to paintings and poems that still breathe centuries later. Maybe that's the ultimate revenge of the infected, to outlive their doctors, their kings, and their gods through art. Pain fades, but a well-painted wound becomes eternal. It's almost funny how consistent we are as a species. Every time humanity suffers, we turn it into culture. Every plague becomes poetry, every heartbreak a ballad, every mistake a movement. Spain just did it with more drama and better lighting. You can see it even now in every museum gift shop postcard. The faces staring back from those canvases aren't saints or sinners. They're just people who learned how to make their suffering look divine. And maybe that's why we still look at them. Because somewhere deep down, we recognize the trick. We too hide our decay under good lighting. We too romanticize our wounds. We too believe that if we make our pain beautiful enough, it might stop hurting. The Spaniards just painted it better. And as the empire's ships crumbled and its cities dimmed, its art kept glowing, proof that beauty doesn't save us from death, but it does make dying interesting. By the time the empire began to crumble, the disease had already outlived the men who carried it. It had moved beyond the flesh, beyond the bones. It had seeped into memory. History, it turns out, is a terrible disinfectant. It doesn't heal wounds. It just forgets where they were. The Spanish called their age golden. But gold is soft. It bends. It tarnishes. It remembers every fingerprint. The same ships that once returned heavy with treasure were now ghosts drifting on the sea, carrying nothing but echoes. And yet, in those echoes, the world had changed forever. The infection wasn't just biological anymore. It had become cultural, spiritual, philosophical. You could trace its ghostly fingerprints through time. The sailors who once feared the wrath of God had given birth to an age that questioned him. The doctors who cut into infected bodies unknowingly cut into the fabric of belief itself. The painters who glorified suffering taught generations how to see beauty in decay. Even the language of love would never be the same again. To love, in Spain, had become synonymous with to suffer. It's as if the entire empire turned heartbreak into a national identity. You can still hear it in flamenco, the cry, the ache, the rhythm of longing. Every guitar string sounds like a nerve stretched too thin. The legacy of disease became something more than pain. It became metaphor. The poets of later centuries wrote about moral infection, about spiritual contagion. The idea that sin spreads like fever outlived the empire itself. When modern philosophers spoke about toxic societies, they were, in a way, quoting the sailors of Seville without realizing it. Humanity had learned a simple truth. Sometimes the sickness isn't in the body, it's in the way we live, the systems we worship, and the lies we tell ourselves to sleep better at night. It's funny, isn't it? We spend centuries inventing gods to punish us for our flaws, when all along, nature does the job perfectly. Medicine, of course, caught up. Centuries later, when scientists finally identified Treponema pallidum, the bacterium behind syphilis, they described it as elegant under the microscope. Elegant, as if they were still half in love with their old tormentor. The disease that once condemned men to madness was now a subject of study, of fascination, even of admiration. We've always had a strange relationship with the things that nearly destroy us. We romanticize them, give them names, turn them into metaphors, and pretend we're above them. But history has a sense of humor. It always makes us repeat what we haven't understood. The parallels are impossible to ignore. What syphilis was to the Renaissance, AIDS became to the 20th century, an invisible mirror reflecting everything humanity fears about itself. Sex, shame, death, and the illusion of control. And just like before, the first reaction wasn't compassion, it was blame. Every epidemic exposes what a society truly values. The Spanish saw disease as divine punishment. Modern people called it immorality. Different century, same sermon. We like to think we've evolved, but often we've just updated our vocabulary. Still, progress sneaks in through the cracks. The same curiosity that once got doctors excommunicated now drives entire branches of science. What was once heresy, studying the body without divine permission, is now a global industry. We build laboratories like cathedrals, worship molecules instead of saints, and whisper prayers in the language of data. Maybe that's what faith has become, the belief that understanding can replace forgiveness. And yet, deep down, we're still those same sailors, afraid of our own appetites, hiding behind rituals, pretending control over the uncontrollable. The irony is delicious. The Spanish Empire set out to conquer the world, but in the process, it taught the world to look inward. The same disease that crippled its armies also sparked its science, its art, its literature. Out of suffering came reflection. Out of humiliation came understanding. It's almost poetic justice. You can't dominate nature without eventually kneeling before it. Empires rise, but bacteria never retire. They're the great equalizers, tiny philosophers teaching us humility one outbreak at a time. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still find beauty in stories of decay. We admire the tragic hero, the fallen empire, the doomed lover. We're addicted to the poetry of our own downfall. It's easier to mythologize pain than to prevent it. Spain didn't just give the world maps and language, it gave the world a template for romantic suffering. That's its truest legacy, the art of turning misery into meaning. If you look closely enough, you can still see it everywhere. In our novels, our films, our headlines, the old patterns repeat. The search for glory, the denial of guilt, the cure that's worse than the disease. We might have traded galleons for smartphones, mercury for misinformation, but the story is the same. Humans trying to outsmart their own nature and failing spectacularly. History isn't a timeline, it's a fever dream that keeps relapsing. But here's the funny part. Despite all that failure, despite all the pain, we never stop trying. That's what makes us unbearable and beautiful at the same time. We fall, we rot, we rebuild, we forget, and then we start the same mistakes in a slightly more sophisticated costume. The sailors who prayed to the Virgin before entering the brothel aren't so different from us scrolling through wellness apps while eating processed food. Same hypocrisy, better lighting. In the end, the story of the Spanish disease isn't about infection. It's about identity, about how fragile we are and how we dress that fragility up in faith, science, or style. It's about the comedy of being human, thinking we can purify desire when desire itself is what keeps us alive. Maybe that's the real joke history plays on us, that the very thing we fear most, decay, imperfection, loss, is also the only thing that makes us real. And so the empire fell, but the lesson lingered. The oceans it once ruled grew silent, but its ghosts still speak through art, through medicine, through the language of longing that refuses to die. We may not see the sailors anymore, but we carry their story in our veins. Their mistakes, their courage, their absurd hope that somehow the next voyage will be different. Perhaps that's humanity's greatest illusion and its greatest strength. We keep sailing into the same storms, convinced this time we'll come back clean. But maybe the sea doesn't want us clean. Maybe it wants us honest. And if history has taught us anything, it's that honesty always begins with a wound. They used to say that disease disappears when the empire does, but that's never really true. Empires die in the history books. Diseases just change their costumes. When Spain's banners stopped fluttering and its ships began to rot in their harbors, the sickness it had spread didn't vanish. It simply slipped into new bodies, new generations, new metaphors. The same infection that once ravaged sailors in Seville was now hiding inside Europe's bloodstream, quietly rewriting what it meant to be human. The body was no longer a temple, it was a battlefield. It's strange to think about it. The same bacteria that once haunted Spanish ports would go on to shape the future of medicine, literature, and even politics. The disease became a storyteller. It whispered into the ears of philosophers, inspired caution in kings, and became a muse for artists who saw beauty in corruption. By the 18th century, syphilis had become fashionable in Paris. The gentleman's disease, they called it. There was even a kind of romantic fatalism attached to it, as if dying slowly from lust made you more sophisticated. It's almost poetic how humans can turn a rotting jaw into a fashion statement. Doctors, ever the alchemists of human suffering, began to study the disease not as a curse, but as a code. They found that it followed patterns, that it obeyed rules, that even decay had rhythm. They discovered that the sickness moved in stages, first passion, then punishment, then madness. If that doesn't sound like a perfect summary of the human condition, I don't know what does. The difference between a disease and a love affair, after all, is just incubation time. There's a story about a French doctor named Philippe Ricoeur who, in the 1800s, became obsessed with curing syphilis. He built a small hospital in Paris and examined thousands of patients, meticulously documenting every rash, every hallucination, every final gasp. He treated people from all walks of life, nuns, poets, soldiers, even aristocrats who swore they'd caught it from a bad kiss. Ricoeur never judged. He just wrote it all down. And when people asked him why he devoted his life to studying such an indecent topic, he supposedly said, "Because there's no better teacher of truth than the body when it stops lying." The disease eventually gave birth to neurosyphilis, a form that attacked the brain, turning philosophers into lunatics, and lunatics into prophets. Nietzsche, Flaubert, even some say Columbus himself, all touched by the same invisible brush. There's something almost divine about it, isn't there? A microbe with the power to rewrite thought, to blur genius and madness until they became indistinguishable. Some of the greatest works of the 19th century were written under the shadow of infection. You can't tell where the fever ends and the philosophy begins. Maybe the disease didn't just destroy minds, it expanded them, forcing humanity to confront what it means to be fragile, to be mortal, to be driven by forces it can't control. Meanwhile, science kept advancing in its clumsy, glorious way. The microscope became the new crucifix. Scientists knelt before it, not to pray, but to look deeper. They found that the world was teeming with invisible life. Millions of tiny creatures dancing in every drop of water, every breath of air. Some of them healed, others killed. The revelation was both thrilling and terrifying. Humanity realized it had never been alone, not even in its own skin. For centuries, people had blamed demons for disease. Now they found that demons had Latin names. The irony, of course, is that progress didn't make people any less superstitious. They just traded saints for serums, confession for consultation. The rituals changed, but the faith remained. A man in 1600 might have prayed for deliverance. A man in 1900 begged for penicillin. Same desperation, different deity. It's funny how science and religion both promise salvation. They just use different wardrobes. When the cure finally arrived in the 20th century, it was almost anticlimactic. Penicillin, a mold, a fungus, something so small and humble, defeated the disease that had terrorized humanity for 400 years. The mighty empire of pain undone by an accident in a petri dish. Alexander Fleming discovered it by mistake, proving once again that history's greatest breakthroughs usually happen when someone forgets to clean up. For centuries, people had prayed to God for mercy. It turns out God outsourced the job to mold, but victory always comes with irony. The cure ended the suffering, yes, but it also erased the story. The disease that had inspired art, shaped morality, and defined entire centuries became just another entry in a medical textbook. The same affliction that once filled cathedrals with prayers was now filed away under treatable. Humanity moved on, forgetting that the cure didn't erase the cause, it just silenced it. Desire remained, the same restless pulse under every civilization, waiting for its next disguise. And it found one. In the 1980s, when AIDS appeared, people reacted the same way they had in the time of the Spanish plague, with fear, blame, and moral panic. It was almost comforting, in a dark way, to see how little had changed. History, like infection, loves repetition. Politicians preached purity, doctors scrambled for answers, and the sick became symbols instead of people. Once again, disease became a mirror, forcing humanity to look at itself and recoil. Every epidemic, no matter how modern, is just the same story rewritten in a new century's language. Somewhere, you can almost hear the laughter of the past, the ghosts of sailors, doctors, and priests watching us repeat their mistakes with Wi-Fi and vaccines. The lesson has always been the same. We think we're fighting the disease, but most of the time, we're just fighting ourselves. Our fear, our arrogance, our need to moralize what should only be understood. And the truly comical part? We never learned, because not learning gives us better stories to tell. Suffering may be hell, but it makes great material. Today we live in an age where everything is clean, sterilized, sanitized. We've conquered most of the old plagues, but in their absence, we've created new ones. Loneliness, anxiety, the quiet infection of constant performance. The body might be safer, but the soul is still catching fevers. We've replaced the church confessional with social media feeds, where people perform their pain instead of healing it. The setting changes, but the ritual doesn't. Humanity still needs its diseases to remember it's alive. And so, in the grand comedy of existence, syphilis becomes less of a tragedy and more of a teacher. It showed us our fragility, our hypocrisy, our humor in the face of decay. It gave birth to art, to medicine, to the idea that even our darkest moments can illuminate something true. The empire fell, the doctors died, the ships turned to dust, but the lesson endured. That pain, when examined closely enough, becomes wisdom. Maybe that's the final irony of history. The very things that break us are the things that teach us how to live. The sailors who carried the disease across the ocean didn't know they were also carrying evolution, knowledge, empathy. Every wound, every fever, every confession carved a small doorway into understanding. And as much as we like to think we've moved beyond all that, the truth is we're still on the same ship. Adrift, infected with our own desires, laughing in the dark, still pretending we're immune. By the time the last Spanish galleons had crumbled into the sea, the story of their disease had already escaped the body and embedded itself into the collective imagination of the world. What had begun as a rash on the flesh became a stain on human history, a reminder that every empire, no matter how gilded, holy, or invincible, eventually sweats, bleeds, and itches like the rest of us. The real infection wasn't the one in their veins. It was the illusion that power could make anyone immune to decay. Empires, like people, always think they're eternal right up until they start losing their teeth. What's fascinating about the Spanish plague of pride and flesh is how it kept evolving long after the ships stopped sailing. It became a metaphor that refused to die. Pain, shame, desire, faith, it was all tangled together in one enormous biological joke that the universe seemed determined to keep telling. The disease taught humanity something it keeps forgetting. We are not the protagonists of nature's story, we're the punchline. Every time we think we've conquered something, it simply mutates, puts on a new hat, and asks, "Miss me?" The descendants of those sailors, the ones who spread the fever and the faith, would grow up to build cities on the ruins of contagion. Madrid, Lisbon, Naples, Mexico City, Lima, each one layered with ghosts. The architecture still carried the paranoia of infection, narrow streets to keep the shade, balconies designed for gossip instead of air, fountains to wash hands before touching anything sacred. Even beauty was built on fear. We like to think progress is born from inspiration, but more often it's born from trauma with good lighting. Medicine improved, but the mindset didn't. People still searched for someone to blame. In the 17th century, it was prostitutes. In the 18th, foreigners. In the 19th, the poor. In the 20th, entire continents. Humanity kept passing the torch of guilt as if shame itself were hereditary. It's almost comforting how consistent we are in our irrationality. The problem was never the disease. It was our refusal to look in the mirror and admit, "I did this." It's easier to blame the devil than your own bloodstream. Still, science marched on, dragging morality behind it like a stubborn mule. By the Enlightenment, Europe had transformed its obsession with sin into an obsession with reason. Doctors dissected, philosophers theorized, and artists painted what they saw instead of what they were told to see. And yet, the same shadow lingered. The Spanish infection, though largely forgotten, had birthed a new kind of curiosity, the morbid kind. The human body became a playground for discovery. Death became educational. People lined up to watch dissections as if they were theater. The same curiosity that once got men burned by the Inquisition was now called progress. Apparently, the difference between heresy and science is just a few centuries of good marketing. Somewhere in a damp university basement, a young anatomist might have been tracing the veins of a corpse and wondering whether this was the same path the disease once traveled, how it moved from port to port, from kiss to kiss, like a rumor that refused to die. The thought must have been both horrifying and thrilling. After all, every great discovery begins with one terrifying question. What if I'm part of the problem? That's the kind of question that keeps civilizations honest and slightly nauseous. Art, too, began to change again. The fascination with divine suffering evolved into the romantic obsession with doomed love. Pain became aesthetic. The same infection that once killed sailors now inspired poets to write about unrequited love as if it were a noble disease. Suffer is to feel deeply, they declared, conveniently ignoring that most suffering feels less like enlightenment and more like a bad rash. But humans are nothing if not creative in justifying pain. We've been turning discomfort into philosophy since the first caveman stubbed his toe and called it destiny. Even as medicine learned to tame the old plagues, new ones arose. each more psychological than the last. The Spanish sailors feared contagion. Modern man fears insignificance. The virus of the 21st century isn't bacterial, it's existential. We've cured the sores, but not the emptiness. We scroll through screens instead of confessional booths, seeking meaning in pixels instead of prayer. We post our pain like it's performance art, hoping someone will click like on our loneliness. If the sailors had seen us, they'd probably laugh, or maybe they'd just recognize the same desperate need to be remembered. What's both tragic and hilarious is that humanity always needs a plague to remember it's alive. When everything is too comfortable, we invent chaos. When life gets too peaceful, we start poking at it like a bored god with a stick. The Spanish Empire did it with exploration. We do it with algorithms. Both end with confusion, fever, and regret. Technology is just the new mercury. It promises to cure us while quietly poisoning the soul. And we love it because we mistake stimulation for salvation. There's a theory among historians that disease shaped the modern world more than any war or invention. Epidemics forced people to collaborate, to adapt, to empathize, or at least to pretend to. Without the syphilitic sailors, there might not have been modern medicine, quarantine systems, or even the concept of global health. Pain, it seems, is a surprisingly effective teacher. It's just that the tuition fees are unbearable. Even now, you can trace the fingerprints of that ancient contagion in how we think about intimacy and morality. We still divide touch into categories: sacred or sinful, clean or dirty, love or lust. We still whisper about bodies as if they're ticking bombs. Every generation invents its own version of purity and then spends decades feeling guilty for not achieving it. It's almost endearing, really, how humanity keeps trying to negotiate with biology, as if nature might give us a discount on consequences. But maybe that's what makes us human, the refusal to stop bargaining. The same stubbornness that made the Spanish sailors leave port, despite knowing half wouldn't return, is what drives us to keep living, keep touching, keep hoping. There's a beauty in that defiance. We know we'll suffer, but we do it anyway. We know desire destroys, but we still reach for it. Maybe we need a bit of madness to feel alive. In the end, the story of the sailor's disease isn't about the past. It's about the constant human illusion that we've moved beyond it. The empire fell, the ship sank, the treatments improved, but the essence of the story remains unchanged. We're still creatures of appetite, trying to rationalize our hunger. We still mistake control for wisdom, faith for certainty, and survival for virtue. The infection was never just a medical event, it was a mirror. And like all mirrors, it showed us what we least wanted to see. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of those old ships, their timbers groaning as they carried the first wave of the modern world. You can hear the laughter of sailors who thought they'd beaten nature, the prayers of priests who thought they could bribe it, the quills of doctors who thought they could explain it. And then you can hear us, centuries later, repeating the same symphony of mistakes, just in a higher definition. Maybe that's what the sea was trying to teach them all along, that nothing ever really ends. Not the voyages, not the desires, not even the diseases. Everything simply changes form. The plague that once rotted flesh now rots certainty. And in that endless cycle of forgetting and rediscovering, humanity keeps proving the same truth. The only thing more contagious than a disease is the hope that next time will be better. History has a way of pretending it learned something. It wraps itself in new vocabulary, invents new ideologies, updates the wardrobe. But underneath, it's the same body, covered in the same scars. By the 19th century, the great Spanish epidemic had been reduced to a few pages in medical textbooks and a cautionary tale for romantic poets. But what no one realized was that the real infection had already gone underground. It was no longer eating through skin or bone, it was eating through meaning. The disease had become philosophy. Doctors had stopped talking about sin, but philosophers had started talking about guilt. The priests had lost their pulpits, but psychologists were building new ones out of couches and ink blots. The language changed, but the sermon stayed the same. Human desire is dangerous, human pleasure has a price, human freedom carries punishment. Freud didn't invent repression. He just gave it better marketing. The sailors once whispered about the fever in their blood. Now people whispered about the fever in their minds. Civilization had learned to wash its hands, but not its conscience. Even the scientists, those brave exorcists of the invisible, couldn't escape the irony. They isolated the bacterium that caused syphilis, named it Treponema pallidum, and placed it under glass. The creature was small, almost elegant, a spiral of death that looked more like a piece of jewelry than a killer. One of the researchers supposedly said, "It's beautiful," and he wasn't wrong. It was the perfect symbol for humanity itself, delicate, intelligent, destructive, and completely unaware of its own absurdity. You can almost imagine nature laughing at the idea of being studied by its own side effects. By then, Europe had learned how to disguise its sickness. The age of exploration had turned into the age of exploitation. The same ships that once carried plague now carried ideology, racism, nationalism, industrial greed. Empires no longer needed sails. They had factories and telegraphs. But the logic hadn't changed. Infection had become metaphorical. Poverty was treated like a contagion, descent like a disease. Governments built hospitals for the poor, not to cure them, but to hide them. The Spanish had used mercury. The Victorians used moral hygiene. The treatment was still worse than the illness. There's something almost comic about how the world kept repeating the same rituals in different costumes. The 16th century sailor bathed in mercury and prayed to St. Roch. The 19th century gentleman swallowed arsenic and quoted Schopenhauer. Both thought they were modern. Both ended up sick. The more medicine advanced, the more humanity realized it couldn't invent a cure for itself. Every new discovery just exposed a deeper flaw. It's as if the species were trapped in an eternal fever dream, forever trying to explain why it keeps burning its own skin. Meanwhile, art refused to let the past rest. Painters still found beauty in corruption. Writers still turned decay into romance. Oscar Wilde joked that to define is to limit, but what he really meant was that disease, like desire, hates boundaries. The symbol of the infected body became shorthand for the infected soul. Syphilis had left its lesions on culture. In the haunted decadence of Baudelaire, in the doomed elegance of Dorian Gray, in every tragic figure who confuses self-destruction with transcendence. The Spanish sailors might have died centuries earlier, but their ghosts were alive in every sentence about forbidden pleasure. And perhaps that's the strangest legacy of all. The sickness made us more self-aware. It forced us to confront the uncomfortable truth that every civilization has its own version of infection, its obsession, its hypocrisy, its secret rot. For the Spanish, it was the body. For the Victorians, morality. For us, maybe it's perfection. We've become allergic to imperfection. We Photoshop our flaws, medicate our moods, and call it progress. The old sailors smeared mercury on their skin. We smear filters on our faces. Same desperation, different century. Even the way we talk about progress feels infected. We speak of virality as if it's success, of going viral as if disease were a compliment. The same species that once prayed to be cured now worships contagion in the form of attention. Every click, every trend, every scandal spreads like a digital fever. It's the same old hunger, the need to be touched, to be noticed, to be remembered, but now it travels at the speed of light instead of the speed of ships. Humanity never outgrew its appetite. It just gave it Wi-Fi. And yet, there's something oddly noble in that. Despite all the mistakes, the superstition, the absurdity, we keep trying to connect. Every infection, literal or metaphorical, is a form of intimacy. It reminds us that we're porous creatures, that no wall, no creed, no empire can make us fully separate. The sailors learned that the hard way. They touched the world and became part of it. Every kiss, every handshake, every breath was a confession. I'm not alone. Maybe that's why the story keeps repeating, because loneliness, not lust, is the real disease. Science eventually gave us cures, but art gave us understanding. The microscope could tell us what killed us. The poem could tell us why we cared. And between the two, humanity stumbled towards something like wisdom. Not peace, never that, but a kind of ironic acceptance. The realization that suffering isn't punishment, it's participation. That decay isn't the end of beauty, it's its proof. The sailors died nameless, their bones dissolving in salt water, but in some twisted way, they helped us see ourselves more clearly. Every scar, every mistake, every feverish confession we call art is part of their inheritance. Sometimes, when you look at a map of the old trade routes, it's easy to imagine their ghosts still sailing those waters, not in flesh, but in meaning. Whispering reminders that nothing humanity creates, good or bad, ever really disappears. Ideas travel the same way diseases do, invisibly, irresistibly, and without permission. You can burn the ships, bury the bodies, erase the records, but the contagion of knowledge, once released, never stops moving. That's the final irony, isn't it? The empire that infected the world with disease also infected it with curiosity. The same voyages that spread plague also spread thought. Pain and progress, lust and learning, sin and science, all mixed in one glorious catastrophic experiment called civilization. We're still running it. We still haven't figured out the dosage. But perhaps that's for the best. If we ever do find a cure for our contradictions, we might stop creating altogether. And maybe, in the end, that's the secret history the sea was always trying to whisper, the one the Spanish sailors never quite understood, that life itself is contagious, that every act of contact, every wound, every story passed from one mouth to another is part of the same endless exchange. We are all infected, with memory, with longing, with the unbearable desire to matter, and there's no medicine for that, only storytelling and the laughter that keeps it from killing us too quickly. It's almost poetic how civilizations rot the same way bodies do, not all at once, but slowly, beautifully, almost tenderly, as if decay itself were an art form. Spain's empire didn't explode, it unraveled thread by thread in a long, feverish sigh. The gold from the New World had turned into debt, the faith that once burned like fire had cooled into ritual, and the diseases they carried, well, those had already completed their work. You could almost hear history chuckle. The same hands that once conquered half the globe couldn't stop their own pulse from trembling. Every empire thinks it's immune until the symptoms start. The irony is that Spain's sickness became its export. The same moral rigidity that condemned flesh as sinful was now institutionalized into bureaucracy and etiquette. The Inquisition had faded, but its mindset lived on in law, in manners, in silence. The Spanish learned to disinfect not only their wounds, but their emotions. You didn't cry, you confessed. You didn't bleed, you repented. The old sailors had carried the infection in their blood. Their descendants carried it in their souls. Even today, you can feel it in the Spanish temperament, that bittersweet blend of passion and guilt, of laughter and mourning, as if every smile remembers the plague. There's something incredibly human about this tendency to confuse cleanliness with virtue. When the body became less frightening, people turned their obsession toward the mind. By the Enlightenment, Europe was trying to scrub itself of superstition, not realizing that reason can be just as delusional when worshipped too hard. The scientists replaced the priests, the laboratories replaced the cathedrals, and yet the rituals stayed the same, rituals of faith, only now disguised as facts. The microscope became a new kind of altar, where believers in progress genuflected before petri dishes instead of crosses. You can almost imagine those early scientists whispering prayers to their experiments. Please, don't explode. Of course, they did explode, sometimes literally. The pursuit of knowledge has always been half curiosity, half accident. The same spirit that drove Columbus to discover lands already inhabited also drove chemists to drink mercury or inject themselves with mysterious substances in the name of science. Curiosity and self-destruction are twin siblings wearing different lab coats. The more humanity tried to master nature, the more it discovered how fragile mastery really is. Every breakthrough came with a new kind of fever. Even politics started catching the infection. The obsession with purity, the same one that had driven the Spanish to cleanse souls, transformed into nationalism. Nations began treating difference like disease, building borders like immune systems. The rhetoric even borrowed medical language: body politic, foreign virus, social hygiene. History's sense of humor remained impeccable. The same empire that had spread germs across the oceans had taught the world how to sterilize compassion. But decay, as always, makes room for beauty. Out of Spain's fading glory came something quieter and infinitely more enduring: the art of remembering. The writers, painters, and musicians of the following centuries began turning failure into melody. Goya painted nightmares so vivid they made illness look like honesty. His grotesques were less about horror and more about recognition. This is who we are when the masks fall off. You can feel the same fever in Lorca's poetry centuries later, his words bleeding rhythm, his imagery burning like infection. The Spanish discovered a strange kind of immortality. When your empire dies, your art becomes its ghost. Even the architecture began to shift. The cathedrals grew darker, heavier, more introspective, as if the stone itself had caught the fever. Baroque, they called it. Ornate, dramatic, delirious. A style that looked like a hallucination sculpted in marble. The ceilings dripped with gold and gilt. You can stand in one of those cathedrals and feel the contradiction vibrating in the air. The desire to reach heaven while sinking beautifully into the earth. Maybe that's why tourists still stare up in awe. They're not admiring faith, they're admiring doubt made visible. The sailors' descendants no longer crossed oceans, but they still chased ghosts. Their explorers became philosophers, their conquistadors became dreamers. The same restlessness that once drove ships across the Atlantic now drove minds inward. Spain started exporting melancholy instead of spice, introspection instead of conquest. It's a fair trade, less blood, more poetry. Yet the sadness remained, quiet but constant, like an echo in the national bloodstream. And perhaps that's why Spanish music sounds the way it does. Flamenco, born from pain and migration, carries the rhythm of a nation that once tried to conquer the world and ended up conquering its own sorrow instead. The singer's voice cracks not from lack of control, but from too much truth. Every guitar string is a confession. You can dance to it, but you can't escape it. That's the beauty of Spanish art. It doesn't heal you. It teaches you how to hurt with dignity. What makes it all even more fascinating is how this emotional inheritance seeped into places the empire once touched. In Latin America, the same paradox flourished. Vibrant joy laced with existential dread, laughter that trembles with memory. From Mexico's Day of the Dead to Argentina's tango, you can trace the DNA of Spain's contradictions. The disease had mutated again, no longer physical, not even moral, but cultural, a celebration of decay disguised as beauty. Humanity had finally learned how to dance with its infection. Meanwhile, modern Spain reinvented itself. The old empire gave way to democracy, then dictatorship, then democracy again. Each transformation carried the same pattern: pain, denial, rebirth. History doesn't heal, it recycles. Even the modern Spanish fascination with cleanliness, order, and aesthetics feels like a subconscious reaction to centuries of chaos. The tiled courtyards, the polished plazas, the obsession with symmetry, all subtle attempts to impose beauty on entropy. The same impulse that made the sailors polish their armor before dying at sea now makes a nation polish its legacy before facing tourists. Yet beneath all that shine, the old ghosts still hum. You can find them in the corners of museums and forgotten letters and songs sung too late at night. The story of Spain's sickness, the literal and the metaphorical, refuses to die because it was never really about medicine. It was about humanity's favorite pastime, pretending not to be fragile. And Spain, in all its contradictions, gave fragility a shape, a rhythm, a language. It turned failure into a cathedral and guilt into a masterpiece. It's strange, but maybe that's why people still feel drawn to Spain, to its history, its art, its paradoxes. It's not nostalgia, it's recognition. We see ourselves reflected in its wounds. The empire that infected half the world ended up becoming a mirror for all of us, showing what happens when pride meets mortality and learns how to waltz. We laugh, we ache, we paint, we perform, all while quietly decaying, pretending we've learned from the past when, really, we've just learned how to narrate it better. And perhaps that's the final lesson of all these centuries of fever and faith. Decay isn't failure, it's continuity. The same rot that destroyed the empire fertilized its art. The same shame that silenced confession gave birth to literature. Every disease leaves a story behind, and every story, no matter how tragic, keeps the pulse alive. The Spanish sailors may have vanished into the sea, but their contagion, of curiosity, of longing, of beauty born from ruin, still flows quietly through us. And maybe that's the sweetest irony of history. The most fragile things are always the ones that last the longest. The strangest thing about history is how it doesn't really end. It just changes costumes and keeps walking. Spain's empire had collapsed into the sea, but its shadow still moved through the world like a rumor that refused to die. The priests were gone, the conquistadors long buried, but the idea that pain and salvation are somehow neighbors, that never left. You could still feel it, centuries later, pulsing quietly beneath the cobblestones of Seville in the songs of flamenco singers, in the way old women crossed themselves before gossiping, just to be safe. Every country inherits its ghosts. Spain simply learned to dance with hers. There's a particular irony in how a nation built on exploration ended up turning inward. After centuries of sending men across oceans, Spain began exploring its own wounds instead. It stopped searching for gold and started mining memory. The diseases that once spread through its harbors were now buried in its psyche, simmering in art, religion, and conversation. The Spanish don't talk about guilt, they perform it. The Holy Week processions, with their candles and hooded penitents, feel less like faith and more like therapy with better lighting. You can stand in a crowd watching it and wonder, are these people praying for forgiveness? Or are they just addicted to spectacle? Maybe both. Humans have always preferred rituals that make them look holy while still feeling dramatic. Even science didn't escape the performance. In the late 19th century, when medicine was finally learning to measure what used to be called sin, Spanish doctors began rewriting history through the lens of biology. They diagnosed everything, madness, melancholy, rebellion, as if the soul were a patient file waiting to be stamped and shelved. The same country that once believed in demons now believed in data. Progress, it turns out, is just superstition with better grammar. One famous physician claimed that the Spanish temperament, its passion, pride, and fatalism, was the residue of centuries of disease. Imagine calling an entire nation a medical symptom. Then again, maybe he wasn't wrong. There's a kind of tragic comedy in how societies inherit their illnesses. The Spanish sailors passed on syphilis. Their descendants passed on introspection. The infection became metaphor. The metaphor became identity. Every generation found new ways to interpret the same fever. Writers called it nostalgia, psychologists called it repression, and poets simply called it the wound. Even the language carries the ache. Words like pena, duende, saudade, they don't translate neatly. They mean something between sadness and beauty, between death and desire. It's as if the entire vocabulary evolved to accommodate the side effects of survival. But what's most fascinating is how that same melancholy became fuel. Spain's greatest artists didn't run from the darkness. They invited it to dinner. Goya, Picasso, Lorca, they all turned pain into art the way alchemists once tried to turn lead into gold. Goya painted nightmares until the nightmares became icons. Picasso reassembled suffering into geometry. Lorca wrote about love and death as if they were roommates who never paid rent. It's not that Spain learned to heal, it learned to make beauty out of bleeding. And in doing so, it gave the world a strange kind of hope. If decay can be painted beautifully enough, maybe it isn't decay at all, maybe it's transformation. Meanwhile, modern Spain began to reinvent itself not by forgetting its past, but by laughing at it. Humor became its new religion, a coping mechanism as powerful as any prayer. The same people who once whispered to saints now crack jokes about death. There's a running Spanish saying, "We bury the dead, then we dance." It's not denial, it's defiance. It's an acknowledgement that tragedy is inevitable, but despair is optional. You can almost imagine the sailors of old shaking their heads, saying, "We suffered for centuries, and this is what they learned. To make jokes?" But laughter, in a way, is the most honest evolution of suffering. It's how humans admit defeat without giving up. And yet, beneath the humor, the old restlessness remains. The urge to explore, to chase something bigger than oneself, didn't vanish with the empire, it just changed shape. Now it lives in art, in travel, in the endless Spanish curiosity for what lies beyond the visible. You see it in the surrealism of Dalí, where reality itself feels seasick, or in the films of Almodovar, where love and madness share the same apartment. It's the same energy that once filled ships with sailors. It just swapped compasses for cameras. The fever never died. It just learned better metaphors. Even the landscape seems to remember. Walk through Andalusia, and you can feel time breathing through the stones. The architecture still holds its contradictions. Moorish arches shadowed by Christian domes, Roman ruins beneath tapas bars. Every brick tells a story about coexistence and conflict, about faith that collapsed and rebuilt itself in a slightly different style. History in Spain isn't something you study, it's something you trip over. The past doesn't stay buried, it just wears new paint. Tourists often say Spain feels alive, but what they really mean is that it feels haunted. The energy of centuries of sin, redemption, laughter, and loss hangs in the air like perfume. Even the light has memory. It hits the walls with the same glow that once guided ships into doomed voyages. And perhaps that's the secret of Spain's survival. It doesn't pretend to be pure. It embraces contradiction, whereas decay, like jewelry, turns guilt into rhythm. The empire may be gone, but the infection it left behind, this fever of beauty, longing, and madness, still pulses through its art, its humor, its people. It's hard not to admire that kind of resilience. Most nations try to disinfect their history, to rewrite the ugly parts until they shine. Spain, on the other hand, turned its scars into its brand. Its cathedrals whisper about conquest and confession. Its food celebrates excess. Its music mourns and rejoices at the same time. It's as if the country decided that the only way to survive shame is to turn it into celebration. And maybe that's the ultimate cure for everything the sailors started, the understanding that redemption isn't about becoming clean, but about accepting the stain and making it sing. You can see it in the way Spaniards live even now. Meals that last for hours, arguments that sound like love songs, laughter that breaks the tension of centuries. The same passion that once sent ships into the unknown now fills plazas at midnight, where strangers share stories as if confessing to each other without a priest. Every glass of wine, every guitar chord, every joke about death is an act of rebellion against history's cruelty. It's not forgetting, it's forgiving through joy. And maybe that's what the story of the Spanish sailors was always about. Not disease, not empire, not punishment, but the absurd resilience of being human. The ability to keep desiring, creating, laughing, even when we know the ending. To turn plague into poetry, guilt into art, failure into rhythm. Every civilization leaves behind its fossils. Spain left behind its feelings. And centuries later, they're still contagious. Because perhaps the ultimate twist of fate is this. The sailors thought they were spreading disease, but what they really spread was humanity itself. Messy, contradictory, beautiful, incurable. The world caught it, and we're still carrying it, singing it, and laughing through the fever. Time has a strange way of turning tragedies into traditions. What once made people weep becomes the thing that draws tourists with cameras centuries later. The sailors who once spread disease and despair could never have imagined that their suffering would one day be romanticized, painted, sung, filmed, and danced. But that's the human condition in a nutshell. We metabolize pain into culture. We take what breaks us and turn it into something we can toast with wine. Spain perfected that alchemy. The empire may have drowned, but the echo of its fever became a heartbeat that never really stopped. What's fascinating is how the disease transformed from a curse into a kind of secret inheritance. You can still see it in the Spanish psyche today, that mixture of fatalism and fire, of laughing at death while flirting with despair. It's not masochism, it's adaptation. The same instinct that once made sailors brave storms now makes artists brave emotion. And the same madness that fueled conquest now fuels creation. Spain didn't bury its ghosts, it taught them to sing. You can feel it in the flamenco singers who tear their throats open for beauty, in the poets who write about love as if it's a form of slow infection, in the painters who fill their canvases with sorrow so rich it looks like gold. It's almost as if the nation decided that since it couldn't cure the disease, it might as well seduce it. There's something almost mischievous in that, like making friends with your own doom. The Spanish call it duende, that untranslatable word that means soul, struggle, spirit, or maybe just the courage to feel everything at once. It's the art of surviving by surrendering. And yet, what's most remarkable is how that emotional DNA spread far beyond Spain. The fever crossed oceans again, but this time, not through blood or skin. It traveled through sound, color, and story. In Latin America, you can hear echoes of that same contradiction in every rhythm, every laugh. Brazilian samba, Argentine tango, Mexican bolero, they all carry the same bittersweet infection. Joy that hurts, sorrow that dances, pain that refuses to sit quietly. The New World inherited the Old World's sickness of feeling too much and pretending it's fine. Humanity has been humming the same melody of contradiction ever since. Modern Spain eventually caught up to its own mythology. When the dictatorship fell and democracy returned, the country faced the same dilemma its ancestors did: what to do with the wounds. Instead of pretending they didn't exist, artists, filmmakers, and writers began digging them up. Almodovar painted grief with lipstick. Buñuel turned repression into surrealism, and musicians like Paco de Lucia turned lamentation into virtuosity. The Spanish instinct for dramatizing pain found its modern form, less an empire, more an identity. It's as if the entire country looked at its reflection and said, "Fine, I'm a mess, but at least I look interesting." That self-awareness became contagious in the best way. Tourists come to Spain expecting beaches and sunshine, but leave haunted by something deeper, the strange electric melancholy that hums beneath all that beauty. It's not sadness, it's recognition, the same feeling you get when a song hits too close to home or when a painting seems to remember something you've never lived. Spain has that effect. It doesn't just show you beauty, it reminds you of everything beautiful you've lost, and somehow you thank it for that. But maybe the real legacy of that old sickness isn't cultural, it's philosophical. Disease, empire, art, faith, all of it forced Spain to wrestle with the same eternal question: what does it mean to be human when you're constantly falling apart? The sailors faced it in their bodies. The poets faced it in their words. Every generation since has found its own way to ask the same thing. The answers keep changing, but the question never dies. Maybe that's why Spain feels timeless. It's built on the bones of people who never stopped asking why suffering exists. And the funny thing is, the more humanity advances, the more that question follows us. We live longer now, but we don't suffer less. We've just outsourced our pain to quieter places. Instead of fevers, we get anxiety. Instead of plague, we get burnout. We still chase cures, only now they come in bottles labeled mindfulness or productivity. The human body may be healthier, but the human spirit still sweats through the same existential fevers. The sailors had mercury, we have meditation apps. Both sting, neither work completely. Still, maybe that's the point. The disease never wanted to kill us, it wanted to remind us that we're alive. Pain isn't the opposite of life, it's proof of it. Without it, we'd never invent gods, art, or antibiotics. We'd never feel urgency or awe. We'd never write love songs or apologies. We'd just exist, clean, safe, and unbearably dull. The sailors didn't know it, but their suffering rewired the world's imagination. Their sickness became our story, and our story keeps mutating into new forms of meaning. And somewhere in all of this, there's a lesson so absurd it almost sounds divine. The worst parts of history are often the ones that make us most human. The same empire that spread disease also spread curiosity. The same pain that silenced generations gave birth to voices that could shake centuries. Maybe that's how evolution really works. Not through survival of the fittest, but survival of the feeling. We endure not because we're strong, but because we keep turning agony into music. You can still sense that pulse today on the streets of Granada, in the laughter of a Madrid cafe, in a child's voice echoing through an alley where soldiers once marched. It's the quiet hum of resilience, that stubborn refusal to let despair have the last word. Spain's story isn't one of conquest or collapse anymore. It's one of transformation. The disease that once rotted flesh has turned into a metaphor that nourishes the soul. It's not gone. It's just evolved into empathy. And maybe that's where the whole saga leads, not toward a cure, but toward understanding. We don't heal from history by erasing it. We heal by learning to carry it without shame. The sailors who brought sickness to Europe didn't know they were also carrying a map of human contradiction. Every fever, every sin, every song since has been tracing those same lines across time. The world they infected became the world we inherited. Imperfect, unpredictable, and astonishingly alive. In the end, that's the only kind of immortality worth having. Not the empire, not the monuments, not the myths, but the ability to keep infecting one another with meaning. To touch, to love, to break, to rebuild. The disease changed forms, but it never left us. And honestly, maybe we should be grateful. Because if being human means carrying a fever forever, at least it's a fever that makes us dream. History has a way of hiding its infections beneath marble and myth. Walk through any European capital and you'll see monuments to courage, conquest, genius, but not to decay. No one builds statues for disease. And yet, if you look closely, you'll find the fingerprints of fever everywhere. In the cautious distance between people on a crowded street, in the perfume that became fashion to mask the smell of rot, in the language itself, virus, plague, contagion, words that still make our pulse quicken. Civilization, it seems, never fully washes its hands. It just switches gloves. What Spain unleashed in the 16th century didn't vanish. It mutated into something psychological, something far more sophisticated than sores or rashes. The physical sickness burned through the body, but the moral one lingered in the bloodstream of culture. The fear of touch, the association between pleasure and punishment, the conviction that desire is dangerous, all that survived long after the ships had sunk. Modernity inherited not the symptoms, but the guilt. We sterilized our hands, but not our hearts, And in a way, we still live under the same diagnosis, just with better lighting and more expensive medicine. If you doubt that, look at how we talk about love. We still use the vocabulary of infection, caught feelings, lovesick, toxic relationship. We even describe attraction as chemistry, which sounds flattering until you remember that chemistry was also how people used to make poisons. It's funny how our metaphors never evolve as much as our technology does. We might have invented antibiotics, but emotionally we're still prescribing mercury. You can see it in art too, though now it wears designer shoes. The old painters used angels and martyrs to explore the tension between sin and salvation. Modern artists use movie stars and influencers. The lighting is different, the pose is the same. In the Spanish Golden Age, a painting of a saint bleeding was called devotion. Today, an ad of someone crying beautifully is called marketing. Humanity's favorite aesthetic hasn't changed. It's still the glamour of suffering, just with better contouring. But there's something deeply revealing in that persistence. We've spent centuries pretending that we've outgrown our obsessions with sin, but what we really did was industrialize them. The Spanish once confessed their sins to priests. We confess ours to algorithms. The church promised absolution. The internet promises engagement. Same ritual, new confessional booth. You could almost admire the efficiency. Now you can be forgiven by strangers you'll never meet, simply by admitting your faults with the right filter. It's not redemption anymore, it's branding. Still, beneath the irony, there's a strange continuity. Every generation, no matter how modern, returns to the same human truth. We are terrified of our appetites and fascinated by them at the same time. The sailors feared disease, but they couldn't stop chasing pleasure. We fear vulnerability, but we can't stop swiping. The tools change, the patterns don't. Desire remains the most contagious thing on earth, and guilt remains its favorite side effect. The Spanish doctors once called it el fuego escondido, the hidden fire. And maybe that's the perfect metaphor for humanity itself. Brilliant, destructive, and impossible to extinguish. Somewhere in that contradiction lies the secret to why we keep creating. Art, after all, is just a socially acceptable fever. The same impulse that drove the sailors to cross oceans drives the writer to fill blank pages and the lover to say, just one more time. It's the same delirium, just with less scurvy. The Spanish Empire may have faded, but its madness, its hunger for meaning through suffering, still fuels the world's imagination. We build our stories the same way they built their ships, with ambition, denial, and the faint smell of smoke. There's a peculiar comfort in realizing that. We like to think that progress means escape, but maybe progress is just learning to live more elegantly with our chaos. Spain's old infection, the one that blurred love and pain, faith and shame, never really disappeared. It evolved into art, philosophy, psychology, and even humor. Especially humor. Because laughter, when you think about it, is just the body's way of saying, yes, I'm dying, but not right now. It's the only medicine that works without side effects. Take, for example, the Spanish tradition of dark humor. They joke about death, poverty, politics, all with the same shrug of cosmic resignation. It's not cynicism, it's wisdom dressed as irony. After all, a culture that's buried in empire, survived inquisitions, plagues, and dictatorships has earned the right to laugh at tragedy. Their laughter isn't denial, it's defiance, a small rebellion against the universe's terrible sense of humor. And that's the thread that ties the centuries together. Defiance disguised as devotion, survival disguised as style. The sailors once believed they were spreading civilization. Instead, they spread the human condition. Every ship carried both disease and discovery, both death and revelation. Maybe that's what makes the story so strangely inspiring. It reminds us that every mistake in history was also an act of curiosity. The same hands that brought infection also built cathedrals, wrote symphonies, painted miracles. Humanity never chooses between creation and destruction. It does both, usually at the same time, and then calls it destiny. You can see that same paradox mirrored in the modern world. Our skyscrapers rise like cathedrals of reason, our screens glow like digital altars, and yet the same fears persist. And we worry about contamination. Only now it's misinformation, ideology influence. We still obsess over purity. Only now it's detoxing and digital cleanses. Woo, we still look for salvation. Only now it comes through Wi-Fi instead of wine. We're just as religious as ever. Our gods are simply made of code. Maybe that's the real legacy of those early Spanish sailors, the way they taught the world that exploration always comes with infection. Every time we reach for something new, we bring our darkness with us. Every breakthrough carries bacteria. Every revolution carries regression. But maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's balance. The light only makes sense with the shadow behind it. And if history is a fever, maybe the point isn't to cure it, but to learn how to dream through the sweating. Because if you look closely, all of this, the ships, the saints, the science, the screens, is just humanity doing what it does best, trying to turn its pain into purpose. The sailors didn't set out to change the world, they were just trying to survive the next storm. But survival, when done long enough, becomes civilization. And civilization, when it remembers its pain, becomes art. The world they infected didn't die, it adapted. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of it all. Every plague leaves behind a pulse, every wound teaches rhythm, every empire, no matter how diseased, adds a verse to the same endless song. We may not know the lyrics, but we keep humming along, generation after generation, proof that even in our sickness, we're still capable of harmony. There's something strangely hypnotic about how history loops around itself, like a fever that breaks and then returns with a slightly different temperature. Humanity keeps inventing new reasons to suffer as if it's allergic to peace. The Spanish sailors didn't know it, but when they crossed the ocean with their diseases, they also carried a metaphor, one that would infect every generation after them. The belief that pain is proof of meaning. We inherited that idea the way we inherit eye color. Somewhere deep inside, we still think that if something doesn't hurt, it isn't real. That idea became the invisible epidemic. It crept into art, into religion, into the way people fell in love. We turned discomfort into a compass. We praise hard work, discipline, sacrifice, as if happiness were a sin and suffering were a sacrament. You can see it in everything from Catholic cathedrals to corporate offices. The decor has changed, but the ritual is the same. Kneel, confess, endure, repeat. The modern world doesn't use whips or rosaries anymore. It uses deadlines and Wi-Fi passwords. Every email notification is just a digital version of divine punishment. Maybe that's why Spain's story still resonates. It's not just a tale of conquest or contagion. It's the prototype of how civilizations grow addicted to struggle. Spain loved its misery with the kind of devotion most people reserve for saints. Even after the empire crumbled, the people refused to let go of their tragic poetry. It's like watching someone break up with their lover and then write songs about it for the next 300 years. Pain became a national hobby, like football or wine, but far more poetic. And yet, out of that tragedy came something magnetic. Because when pain is treated not as punishment but as performance, it transforms. The Spanish learned to romanticize their wounds so beautifully that the rest of the world couldn't look away. Goya's paintings, Lorca's poems, the wail of a flamenco singer at 2 a.m., they're all symptoms of the same illness, the refusal to be numb. That's what makes it so intoxicating. In a world obsessed with comfort, Spain still knows how to feel. It's a talent, really, turning catastrophe into culture. Other nations built economies. Spain built emotion. The disease that once ravaged bodies became a kind of spiritual inheritance. The pain didn't vanish. It evolved into rhythm. You can hear it in the Cante Hondo, those deep, almost primal songs that feel like grief dressed up for a night out. The singer doesn't want pity. He wants witness. It's as if the entire country decided that if they had to suffer, they might as well make it sound good. Of course, there's something darkly funny about how human beings can make art out of anything, even infection. We could fall down a flight of stairs and somehow find a metaphor in it. Ah, we'd say, bleeding. This fall represents the descent of modern man. Maybe that's why art never dies. It feeds on our inability to stop dramatizing. Spain just got there first. The country turned disease into identity, despair into performance, guilt into gold leaf. Every generation since has been trying to do the same thing, just with better lighting and therapy. But what if that instinct, the one that makes us romanticize our wounds, isn't a flaw but a form of survival? The sailors who brought the sickness to Europe couldn't cure it, so they did the next best thing. They gave it meaning. Maybe that's all we've ever done as a species, translate suffering into story so we can stand to keep living. The human body dies from infection, the human spirit dies from pointlessness, and storytelling is our antibiotic. We don't want to be healed, not really. We just want our pain to make sense. You can see it in modern life everywhere. People curate their heartbreaks online, frame their burnout as ambition, and package their existential crises as self-improvement journeys. We've turned misery into content. It's brilliant in a slightly horrifying way. The Spanish sailors had mercury. We have hashtags. We even sell candles labeled melancholy. Imagine trying to explain that to someone from the 16th century. We don't cure the sadness anymore. We monetize it. Progress. Still, there's something beautifully self-aware about that. It means we've stopped hiding from our contradictions and started performing them. Humanity has always been a little theatrical, but Spain taught us how to turn tragedy into choreography. Flamenco isn't just dance. It's therapy, disguised as rhythm. Every stomp, every spin, every anguished note says, I'm still here. And maybe that's what all of us are doing, one way or another, dancing our way through the fevers of our time. Even science, the supposed enemy of superstition, isn't immune to the poetry of it all. Modern medicine may have eradicated syphilis with penicillin, but it didn't erase the fascination. Researchers still study it as if trying to decode a love letter from the past. Some even call it the romantic disease. It's absurd and touching at the same time, like giving nostalgia a microscope. We can't help ourselves. We're addicted to turning even our pathogens into metaphors. And in a way, maybe that's evolution. Not biological, but emotional. The old sailors believed God was punishing them for lust. Modern people believe the universe is teaching them lessons through heartbreak. Different century, same coping mechanism. The irony is that we're probably the healthiest generation in human history, yet we're also the most anxious. We've cured the body, but the soul keeps catching the same infection. Maybe it's because we still think peace is something we have to earn instead of something we can simply feel. But even in that irony, there's hope, because every time history repeats itself, we get a little better at laughing about it. The Spanish sailors couldn't laugh. Their bones sank in the sea, but their descendants can. The laughter doesn't erase the pain, it reframes it. It's the difference between tragedy and comedy. Timing. Give humanity a few centuries, and we'll turn any nightmare into a punchline. It's our greatest survival instinct. And perhaps that's what Spain's long, fevered story has been trying to teach all along. That infection, in the end, is just another word for connection. Every sickness, every heartbreak, every act of creation spreads from one person to another, changing form but never disappearing. The disease that once crossed oceans in silence has become something else entirely. The shared pulse of empathy. We're all still contagious, not with illness, but with meaning. And maybe that's what keeps us alive, the glorious, ridiculous, unkillable urge to pass our fever on. If there's one thing the Spanish sailors unknowingly discovered, it wasn't a new continent, it was the anatomy of human contradiction. They set out to conquer the unknown, and instead uncovered how fragile they really were. It's funny when you think about it. Men who could stare down hurricanes and mutinies were terrified of their own bodies. They could face cannon fire without blinking, but a rash? That was divine punishment. The irony is almost tender. It reminds us that bravery is often just fear in better clothes. Centuries later, that same fear still sits quietly beneath the surface of everything we call progress. We may no longer believe that diseases come from sin, but we still moralize sickness. When someone falls ill, we whisper about lifestyle choices, genetics, karma, or bad energy. We can't seem to accept that sometimes things just happen. The Spanish sailors thought God was angry. We think the algorithm is. The only thing that's really changed is who we blame. And yet, the fear of contamination never left us. It just got better manners. The ports of Seville once overflowed with rumors of infection. Today, airports do the same, only with hand sanitizer instead of holy water. Even the language we use, going viral, spreading ideas, is a kind of linguistic souvenir from those days. The internet didn't invent contagion, it just digitized it. Every post, every outrage, every meme is a tiny epidemic. We share emotions like sailors shared fevers, without consent or quarantine. But that's what makes it fascinating. Humans are wired to spread things. Not just disease, but dreams, stories, anxieties, and laughter. We are the only species that infects with imagination. The Spanish Empire tried to colonize land. Modern humans colonize attention. It's the same impulse wearing new boots. Every influencer is a conquistador in Wi-Fi armor, charting digital territories and claiming them in the name of engagement. The world hasn't changed. It just glows now. You can see echoes of that old maritime madness in how we live. The sailors navigated by stars. We navigate by notifications. They crossed oceans to feel significant. We crossed timelines. They got lost in storms. We get lost in comment sections. And like them, we call it discovery when it's often just distraction. The sea they faced was literal. Ours is infinite scrolling. Somewhere, a Spanish sailor from the 1500s is looking down, shaking his head, saying, "At least we had scurvy to show for it." But maybe that's why we can't stop repeating their story, because it's not about ships or sickness, but about the lengths we'll go to avoid emptiness. The sailors carried diseases across the world because they couldn't stand still. Modern humans do the same with thoughts, opinions, and emotions. Stillness terrifies us. The silence between two breaths feels unbearable, so we fill it with noise, with ambition, with panic. The plague of our century isn't bacterial, it's existential. The Spanish called theirs el mal del cuerpo, the sickness of the body. Ours is el mal del alma, the sickness of the soul. And yet, every time the world gets too loud, there's always someone who looks at the chaos and decides to make art out of it. That's how it's always been. From the ashes of empires rise poets with ink-stained fingers. From the fevers of sailors come painters who capture agony so beautifully that people call it divine. Pain somehow keeps finding its way into beauty. Maybe it's evolution's little joke, that we survive by turning our suffering into something others can admire. It's a dangerous talent, though, because once you start making beauty out of pain, you start looking for pain to make beauty from. It's a cycle Spain perfected. The same country that once built cathedrals as penance later built masterpieces out of regret. It's as if guilt became the national muse. You can see it in the way Spanish culture flirts with death, not to defeat it, but to seduce it. The matador, the flamenco dancer, the poet, and they all face mortality like an old lover. It's not bravery, it's intimacy with the inevitable, and maybe that's why Spain still feels different from the rest of Europe. While others celebrate triumph, Spain celebrates tragedy. The English built museums, the French built theories, but Spain built emotions. It never tried to cure its infection, it curated it. And maybe that's the secret to its immortality. It learned that decay, if done with enough style, can outlast glory. Empires fall, feelings echo, Of course, there's a certain comedy in all this. The same country that once believed mercury could cure everything now sells bottled water infused with minerals at luxury prices. History loves its punchlines. We roll our eyes at medieval superstition, forgetting that our own wellness trends are just updated versions of alchemy. People once believed bathing in silver purified the soul. Now they call it detox. Somewhere, a 16th century apothecary is whispering, "I told you so." But if there's something redeeming in this endless repetition, it's that each cycle brings a little more awareness. Maybe we can't escape our contradictions, but we can at least laugh at them. And laughter, in its own way, is a vaccine against despair. The sailors didn't have that luxury. They died in the belief that the world was flat, that pain was punishment, and that faith could save them. We, on the other hand, have memes and midlife crises. Call it progress. Still, beneath the humor, something sacred lingers. The recognition that every age, no matter how advanced, still wrestles with the same fever. The need to make sense of being alive. The sailors crossed oceans to find God. We cross search engines to find meaning. Both journeys end the same way, with wonder, confusion, and an oddly satisfying exhaustion. And that's the quiet beauty of it all. The infection that started in the ports of Spain became a metaphor for existence itself. It reminds us that everything spreads: love, fear, knowledge, decay, and that to live is to risk contamination. The only choice we have is what we want to carry forward. The Spanish sailors didn't know they were exporting humanity's greatest paradox, that fragility and courage are the same thing seen from different angles. So maybe the true legacy of their voyage isn't the disease, but the lesson hidden within it, that to be human is to keep sailing, even when the maps are wrong, even when the compass spins, even when the cure looks suspiciously like the cause. We stumble forward, infected with curiosity, burning with contradictions, laughing between prayers, always halfway between discovery and disaster. And maybe that's not a curse after all. Maybe that's the only proof we were ever truly alive. If you listen carefully, history doesn't whisper, it coughs. Every age thinks it's healthy while fevering through its own delusions, and the Spanish sailors were just the first to teach us that lesson in Technicolor. Their story is humanity's patient zero, the original outbreak of our favorite illness, the need to believe that suffering makes us special. The empire that bled gold also bled meaning, and we've been transfusing from it ever since. What's remarkable is that we still repeat their logic, just with better branding. They believed sin caused disease. We believe stress causes everything. The 16th century priest shouted, "Repent, or God will strike you down." And today's wellness guru whispers, "Relax, or cortisol will kill you." Same anxiety, new vocabulary. Both offer salvation in exchange for discipline. Both sell candles. You can't even escape it in science. Every article starts with "studies show," the modern equivalent of "as it is written." We trust the lab coat like they trusted the robe. Both are costumes for certainty. That craving for certainty might be the real infection. The sailors couldn't handle the chaos of the ocean, so they invented God's plan. We can't handle the chaos of information, so we invent algorithms. One tells us what's moral, the other what's trending, but both exist to stop us from admitting we're lost. It's strange how progress always ends up looking like nostalgia. We keep inventing technology to recreate the feeling of prayer. Scroll long enough, and you'll notice the rhythm. It's meditation with a dopamine sponsor. But even amid all the noise, something strangely beautiful persists. The human compulsion to connect, to reach across our own fear of contamination and say, "Touch me anyway." The sailors did it, knowing they might die for it. We do it through screens, knowing it might break us. The tools change, but the ache stays the same. The Spanish called it duende. Psychologists call it attachment. Poets call it love. All of them are just ways of saying, "I'd rather risk infection than die untouched." And the more we evolve, the more we realize we're not erasing the past, we're translating it. The Spanish carried disease, we carry data. They spread fever, we spread information. But information, like fever, can burn. A rumor today travels faster than any galleon ever could, crossing oceans in seconds, infecting millions with outrage, fear, or hope. The irony is almost perfect. The empire that once traded in gold and infection has given way to an empire that trades in attention and anxiety. Both are addictive, both feel divine while they're killing you, and both end with the same question: was it worth it? It's easy to mock the sailors for their ignorance, but imagine being them for a moment. Adrift between continents, caught between superstition and discovery, dying from something no one could name. Their entire worldview was collapsing, and yet they kept sailing. There's something profoundly human in that stubbornness. We do the same thing, only now our ships are emotional rather than wooden. We navigate heartbreaks, jobs, and existential dread with the same mixture of faith and denial. Every smartphone is a compass pointing to nowhere, and still we follow. And maybe that's why their story still clings to us, because we recognize ourselves in their delirium. They mistook infection for enlightenment. We mistake distraction for purpose. They prayed for miracles. We refresh for them. The sailor staring at the horizon isn't so different from someone staring at a glowing screen at 3 a.m., waiting for something meaningful to appear. The horizon just got smaller, that's all. The loneliness stayed exactly the same. It's tempting to believe that knowledge immunizes us, but every discovery seems to create new diseases of the mind. We cured syphilis, only to invent anxiety disorders. We eradicated scurvy, only to invent burnout. We've mastered hygiene, but can't handle boredom. Maybe that's the price of progress. When the body heals, the soul finds new places to ache. The Spanish sailors died from their voyages. We die from not knowing where we're going. And yet, every now and then, humanity surprises itself. Amid all our absurdities, we create things so beautiful they almost justify the pain. The same hands that once spread sickness now build hospitals. The same instinct that sought conquest now builds telescopes to look at galaxies. The same desire that doomed empires also writes symphonies. You can almost feel the echo of those sailors in every artist, scientist, and dreamer who decides that discovery is worth the risk. Infection, it turns out, was just curiosity in disguise. What makes it even funnier is that we keep trying to sterilize the very thing that makes us human. We create safe spaces, clean energy, ethical consumption, all noble ideas, but deep down, we know life doesn't stay clean. Love isn't clean, art isn't clean, even kindness leaves a mess. Maybe that's why Spain's legacy feels so eternal. It reminds us that rot and beauty grow from the same soil. The sailors brought disease, yes, but they also brought perspective. That no civilization, no body, no heart stays untainted forever. And maybe that's not tragedy, it's texture. There's an old saying in Andalusia, lo que duele enseña. What hurts, teaches. Maybe that's what the sea was whispering to those ships all along. Pain isn't punishment, it's the price of consciousness. To feel deeply, to fall, to rot, to rebuild, it's the only way to know you're alive. We can sanitize the world as much as we want, but we'll never scrub that truth away. So the next time we look back at those Spanish sailors, maybe we shouldn't see them as villains or victims, but as mirrors, tiny, feverish reflections of ourselves, lost, hopeful, terrified, absurdly ambitious, carrying both death and discovery in the same breath. They didn't spread a curse, they spread a question. What does it mean to be alive when everything you touch can destroy you? And maybe the only answer worth giving, the one that's been echoing through every century since, is the simplest, the most human of all. Touch anyway. Somewhere between the creaking of wooden ships and the hum of fluorescent hospital lights, humanity decided that progress was about control. The Spanish sailors wanted to control the ocean, to make the unpredictable predictable. They built maps to tame the unknown, prayers to bargain with fate, and hierarchies to ensure someone, somewhere, was always in charge. It was the beginning of our favorite illusion, that if we just organize the chaos well enough, we'll never have to feel lost again. But control, as history keeps proving, is just fear with good posture. It's strange how the same species that crossed oceans out of curiosity now panics when the Wi-Fi drops. The sailors feared storms, we fear silence. They battled waves, we battle algorithms. We measure everything, steps, calories, followers, as if quantifying life could protect us from its unpredictability. It's the same mindset that once made people believe that confession could erase sin or that mercury could cure disease. Modern people just replaced priests with data analysts. Forgive me, Excel sheet, for I have sinned. I didn't meet my quarterly goals. There's a tragic humor in that. The sailors carried viruses across continents, and we carry them across networks. A single click can infect the globe with panic or wonder. The old plagues were physical. Today's are psychological. Our diseases have better Wi-Fi. You don't get sores anymore, you get burnout. You don't lose teeth to scurvy, you lose sleep to comparison. But the symptoms are identical: exhaustion, longing, and a vague sense that you're a part of something enormous and meaningless at the same time. And maybe that's what makes the story of those sailors so endlessly relevant. They were the prototype for modern man, brave enough to chase what they didn't understand, and foolish enough to think they could own it once they found it. Every explorer, every entrepreneur, every person who's ever opened a dating app at 2 a.m. is reenacting the same scene, the quest for connection in a world too vast to comprehend. We've just swapped sails for screens. The sea is still there, only now it fits in your pocket. But control was never the point, was it? The ocean never stops being wild. You can map its currents, predict its tides, even photograph it from space, but it will always do what it wants. Maybe the same is true for us. The Spanish Empire collapsed not because it lacked power, but because it mistook dominance for direction. It's the same mistake every generation makes, believing that mastery means safety. But mastery, at best, just buys you a more comfortable kind of uncertainty. That's why the sailors fascinate us. They remind us of the moment before the illusion, before the world was dissected into neat categories and labeled with Latin. Back then, discovery still felt like a conversation with mystery. They didn't have vaccines or Google, but they had awe, and awe is the first step to wisdom. Somewhere along the line, we traded awe for analysis. We started believing that if we could explain everything, we could feel everything less. But explanation is a poor substitute for wonder. You can't cure loneliness with logic. It's ironic, really. Humans invented science to fight chaos, and then used art to mourn the loss of it. You can see it everywhere. In the melancholy of Spanish guitar, in the surrealism of Dali's melting clocks, in the haunted silence of Goya's dark paintings. They all whisper the same truth. We miss what we tried to destroy. The sailors may have spread disease, but they also spread imagination. Every empire collapses, but every story lives longer than the flag that birthed it. And what a strange inheritance it is. The world they infected became obsessed with cleanliness, of body, of thought, of history. We bleach everything now, even our narratives. We want heroes without flaws, nations without guilt, progress without consequences. But bleach doesn't purify, it erases. Spain's wounds, as grotesque as they were, at least had the decency to scar instead of vanish. Scars are honest. They remind you that survival isn't the same as innocence. You can see this honesty in the smallest things. In a marketplace in Cadiz, old women still sell herbs their grandmothers used to treat sailors' sores. They don't work, not really, but the ritual does. It's not medicine, it's memory. And maybe that's what modern life lacks. Rituals that remind us of where we came from. We don't want healing anymore. We want efficiency. The sailors endured agony. We file HR complaints. Both have their place, but one builds endurance while the other builds spreadsheets. Maybe the cure isn't to eliminate the fever, but to learn how to live with it. The Spanish understood this instinctively. They didn't separate beauty from suffering or holiness from sin. Their churches are proof of it. Gold leaf shining over bones, angels sculpted beside gargoyles, light bleeding through stained glass like forgiveness disguised as fire. They didn't hide the darkness. They choreographed it. The modern world could use a little of that honesty. Our light is too sterile. It never flickers. And here's the cosmic punchline. After centuries of trying to master everything, we've circled back to the same mystery. We're still searching for meaning in the mess, still terrified of our own hunger, still hoping that connection will save us from ourselves. The sailors' ships rotted away, but their question didn't. How do you live knowing that the same hands capable of discovery are also capable of destruction? We've been rewriting that question ever since, through poetry, through medicine, through love. Maybe that's the quiet lesson buried in the fever of history. You can't control the ocean. You can't control desire. You can't control what spreads once it's alive, whether it's disease or an idea or the simple urge to be remembered. You can only sail through it, coughing and laughing, terrified and alive, knowing the destination doesn't matter half as much as the movement itself. And maybe that's why the world keeps returning to Spain's story, because it's not about conquest or collapse. It's about contagion, not of illness, but of humanity. The kind that refuses to stay clean, the kind that knows beauty and rot are just different stages of the same bloom, the kind that infects every generation with the same impossible hope, that even if we destroy everything we touch, maybe, just maybe, we can make it mean something before we sink. If you've ever stood in front of the ocean and felt small, then you already understand the mindset of the Spanish sailors. It wasn't just water stretching to infinity, it was possibility, punishment, and prophecy all at once. Every wave was a question. What if we never come back? What if we find paradise? What if paradise kills us? That blend of terror and temptation is what drove them forward, and honestly, it still drives us. The only difference is that now, instead of navigating by stars, we navigate by notifications. Same uncertainty, less poetry. The sailors didn't fear death as much as they feared being forgotten. That's the part we never admit about ourselves. We can handle pain, but obscurity terrifies us. They carved their names into wood and stone. We carve ours into servers and timelines. They believed that legacy was a kind of immortality. We believe it's virality, and yet both are haunted by the same truth, that time forgets everyone eventually. Maybe that's why we keep building new worlds, new empires, new feeds. We're not trying to survive, we're trying to echo. But echoes can be dangerous things. They distort. The Spanish sailors brought back more than gold and disease. They brought stories, some true, some invented, all contagious. They told tales of cities made of silver, fountains of youth, and islands where the air healed you just by breathing. Those stories spread faster than any plague because they gave people something stronger than medicine. Hope. And hope, like infection, never dies quietly. It mutates. It survives every quarantine. It finds its way into every generation's bloodstream under new names. Progress, enlightenment, technology, self-optimization. It's almost comical how predictable we are. A 16th century Spaniard would cross an ocean chasing eternal youth. A 21st century American will drink celery juice for the same reason. Both are convinced the secret to life lies just one miracle away. We never learn that immortality isn't about living forever. It's about living vividly enough that it feels like it might never end. The sailors had no antibiotics, but they had adventure. We have medicine, but we've outsourced our adventure to screens. One day, archaeologists will dig up our smartphones and call them our relics of worship, and they won't be wrong. There's a strange beauty in how the human instinct for exploration keeps reincarnating. The Spanish galleons gave way to space rockets. The diseases of the flesh became diseases of the mind. The universe got bigger, but the hunger stayed the same. Every astronaut launching into the void is, in some way, a descendant of those fevered sailors who stared at the horizon and thought, there must be more. They were right, there was more. But more always comes with a price tag. The sailors paid in blood, we pay in burnout. Even our modern cures carry the ghost of that same contradiction. We invent antidepressants to numb the ache of meaning, meditation apps to commodify stillness, and vacations to simulate freedom. We don't heal anymore, we manage. The Spanish sailors at least had the decency to collapse dramatically on deck. We just quietly crumble in open-plan offices. And yet, despite all that, we keep going. There's something heroic, and a little ridiculous, about humanity's refusal to give up on itself. We're a species of optimists with trust issues. Maybe that's why Spain's story still fascinates. It's not the empire we admire, it's the audacity. They saw the abyss and said, let's name it. They didn't conquer the world, they personalized it. Every piece of land they touched became a reflection of their contradictions, devout and violent, passionate and cruel, creative and corrupt. They infected continents not just with disease, but with emotion. You can still feel it today, from Buenos Aires to Manila, the tension between longing and loss, pride and guilt. It's the emotional residue of empire, and no vaccine can erase it. What's remarkable is that Spain never tried to hide from that shadow. Instead, it built cathedrals out of it. Its art, its literature, its music, they all hum with the same feverish undertone, beauty born from decay. Velázquez painted the dignity of servants. Cervantes turned madness into wisdom. Lorca made death sound like a love song. The Spanish learned what most of the world still hasn't, that tragedy, when embraced, becomes transformation. You don't need to cleanse history, you need to compost it. That's where the richest soil grows. And maybe that's the real secret behind the disease that changed the world. It forced humanity to admit that perfection was a fantasy. The sailors thought they were spreading faith and civilization, but what they really spread was fragility. The world became smaller, dirtier, and infinitely more human. Every plague, every empire, every heartbreak since has been another reminder that we're all just temporary constellations. Briefly aligned, beautifully flawed, desperately alive. If you think about it, it's both terrifying and liberating. The sailors feared contamination because they didn't understand it. We fear connection because we understand it too well. To touch another person, physically, emotionally, spiritually, is to risk change. And change, like disease, rewrites you without permission. Maybe that's why we sanitize everything, from our hands to our emotions. We're terrified of being altered. But the Spanish sailors didn't have that luxury. They were changed by every wave, every wound, every port. And maybe that's what made them human in the fullest sense. They let the world touch them back. What survives of them now isn't the gold or the maps or even the myths. It's the reminder that infection, in its purest form, is connection. To live is to be contagious, to influence, to be influenced, to pass fragments of yourself to others whether you mean to or not. The sailors spread disease because they touched the world. We spread stories because we can't stop touching each other's minds. It's the same instinct, reframed by history. And that's the punchline, isn't it? That what once killed us now defines us. We didn't overcome contagion, we evolved into it. So when you think of those ships, sailing under dying stars, their decks filled with coughing men and stolen treasures, don't see monsters, see mirrors. They were us, just louder, braver, and with worse dental hygiene. They carried their fears across oceans. We carry ours across timelines. And like them, we'll probably die convinced that the next horizon holds salvation. But that's the beauty of it, because even if it doesn't, we'll keep sailing anyway. That's what makes the story worth telling. Not that it ends well, but that it never really ends at all. It's strange how history never really dies, it just changes costume. The Spanish sailors may have been buried centuries ago, but their spirit still lingers in the way humanity moves, trades, dreams, and self-destructs. You can see it in airports at 3 a.m., filled with exhausted travelers chasing something they can't name. You can hear it in the endless hum of servers and stock markets, that same feverish rhythm of expansion and collapse. The ships have turned into screens, the oceans into networks, but the current underneath is identical, the need to go somewhere, even when we don't know why. The sailors thought they were searching for gold, but what they were really searching for was proof that their lives mattered. That's the same thing that drives us to check our phones every 10 seconds to see if anyone noticed we exist. The ocean was their algorithm, mysterious and dangerous. Ours just fits in our hands. They face storms and mutinies. We face comment sections and credit scores. It's a quieter kind of drowning, but drowning all the same. And yet, despite the absurdity of it all, there's something deeply human in that madness. The Spanish sailors didn't have a map that told them where the edge of the world was. They had to invent it. Every voyage was both an act of courage and an act of arrogance. That combination, bravery dressed as delusion, is basically the engine of civilization. Every great invention, every empire, every love story begins the same way, with someone saying, "What if?" and someone else saying, "That's a terrible idea," and then both of them doing it anyway. You can't really blame them for the chaos that followed. How could anyone understand the consequences of touching the unknown? They were the first domino in a chain reaction that still hasn't stopped falling. The diseases they carried were just the beginning. What they really spread was acceleration. The world got smaller, faster, hungrier. Every century since has been an echo of that same impulse to conquer distance. We just moved from sails to satellites, from muskets to microchips. Every tool we invent is a new way to reach farther, faster, and sometimes to fall harder. There's a certain comedy in watching humanity repeat its mistakes in higher definition. The sailors infected continents because they didn't know what they carried. We infect minds because we don't care what we share. One man sneezed on a ship and doomed a generation. One tweet goes viral and ruins a decade. The speed is different, but the mechanism is the same. Connection without reflection. We keep touching the world and then acting surprised when it touches back. Still, there's beauty in that danger. Connection, even when it hurts, is proof that we're alive. The sailors knew that in their own way. They sailed not just for wealth, but for wonder, for the chance to see what lay beyond the horizon, even if it killed them. It's hard not to admire that kind of reckless awe. We've tried to replace it with safety and efficiency, but deep down, we miss the thrill of risk. That's why people still climb mountains, fall in love with strangers, and start businesses that will probably fail. We want to be tested by something bigger than ourselves. The sailors had the sea, we have the future. But the sea, in its cruel wisdom, always reminds those who cross it that everything has a cost. Every new world discovered means another one disturbed. Every gain hides a loss. The sailors didn't just spread disease, they also brought mirrors, literally and metaphorically. They forced civilizations to see themselves reflected in someone else's eyes, and that kind of reflection is always uncomfortable. That's the real contagion they unleashed, awareness. Once you've seen yourself from another angle, you can't unsee it. Maybe that's why so much of Spain's art feels haunted. It carries the weight of too much seeing, too many faces, too many sins, too many truths. In Velázquez's Las Meninas, even the viewer becomes part of the painting, caught in the act of observation. It's as if he's saying, you're not outside the story, you're infected too. And he's right, we all are. Every civilization is a mixture of what it created and what it destroyed. Spain just had the misfortune and the brilliance to make that contradiction beautiful. Modern Spain, for all its contradictions, still pulses with that same fever. Walk through the narrow streets of Seville at sunset, and you can almost feel the centuries sweating through the stones. The smell of salt, the echo of church bells, the laughter that sounds like defiance. It's all part of the same inheritance. The empire may have died, but the emotion survived. It's in the way Spaniards talk with their hands, as if words alone aren't enough to hold the intensity of living. It's in the way they eat, drink, argue, and mourn, all with the same ferocity. They don't separate passion from pain. They know both come from the same source. It's tempting to romanticize that, but there's wisdom buried in it. Spain never learned to suppress its contradictions. It learned to dance with them. That's what flamenco really is, a choreography of chaos. Each stomp, each wail, each pause between notes says what history couldn't. We suffered, we sinned, we survived. It's not just music, it's defiance wrapped in rhythm. And maybe that's what the world needs more of. Not denial, but transformation. Pain doesn't disappear when you ignore it. It becomes art when you face it. And that brings us back, in a strange way, to those sailors. They didn't know it, but they were the first moderns. They lived in a world that was breaking apart and pretended it was being born. They mistook exploration for salvation, discovery for destiny. But in doing so, they left behind a map, not of geography, but of the human condition. A map where every path leads through contradiction, faith and fear, beauty and decay, progress and plague. Maybe that's why their story never really ends. Because it's not about Spain or disease or empire. It's about us, about the fever that keeps pushing humanity forward, even when the cure might kill us. The same fever that built cathedrals and skyscrapers, painted masterpieces, and made mistakes so large they still echo. It's the fever of wanting more, of refusing to settle, of believing against all evidence that the next horizon will finally make sense of everything. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. Not to be cured, but to keep searching. To keep crossing oceans, literal, emotional, digital, knowing that what we find will change us. The sailors died for their discoveries, but their fever lives on in us. It's the pulse beneath every ambition, every heartbreak, every work of art. We are still at sea, still infected, still sailing into the unknown with nothing but hope and hunger to guide us. And that's what makes the story beautiful, that no matter how many times the ship sinks, humanity always builds another one. There's something oddly poetic about how every civilization leaves behind its diseases like love letters to the future. The Spanish sailors left syphilis. We'll probably leave anxiety and microplastics. Each generation adds its own flavor to the same eternal truth. Progress always comes with an infection. You can disinfect a wound, but not a world. And maybe that's the point. Humanity doesn't evolve by staying clean. It evolves by surviving the mess. The sailors believed they were carrying salvation, not sickness. That's the most human mistake of all. Every empire thinks it's the cure. Spain thought it was spreading faith. Europe thought it was spreading reason. We think we're spreading enlightenment through Wi-Fi. But every cure turns out to have side effects. Colonization left cultural fevers, industrialization left smoke, and the digital age left us with a kind of invisible plague, loneliness disguised as connection. It's as if humanity keeps reinventing the same disease, just in prettier packaging. The irony is that the sailor's actual disease, the one that rotted flesh and drove men mad, was also, in its own dark way, an emblem of desire. It spread because people touched each other. It was the physical embodiment of intimacy's risk. You can't catch something without contact, and that's the paradox we've never solved. To connect is to contaminate. The Spanish sailors learned that lesson brutally, but they also forced the world to face it. Every port they entered became a reminder that pleasure and peril travel together. Maybe that's why we still moralize love so much. It's our leftover guilt from that first epidemic of passion. And if you look closely, you can still see the residue of that guilt in how we talk about love today. Falling, catching feelings, heartache, all of it sounds like symptoms. We romanticize what kills us and medicate what saves us. The sailors, at least, had the honesty of dying for what they desired. We, on the other hand, prefer to ghost people and call it self-care. Somewhere, a 16th century Spaniard is watching from the afterlife, confused. You people have penicillin and still die alone? But there's something magnificent about how the same force that destroyed lives also created art. The disease didn't just ravage bodies, it reshaped imagination. Renaissance painters began depicting flesh differently, fragile, imperfect, trembling. Writers filled their pages with obsession and decay. Music grew darker, more human. You could say that Europe's first modern art movement wasn't born in a palace, but in a fever. The sailors didn't bring beauty intentionally, but they brought the conditions that made beauty necessary. It's almost funny how often that happens, how pain, without asking permission, becomes the muse of history. It's the same dynamic that fuels every era's contradiction. The sailors chased God across oceans and found guilt instead. We chase meaning across screens and find distraction. It's always the same trade. You go searching for light and end up worshiping your own shadow. Maybe that's why the Spanish, more than anyone, learned to laugh at despair. Their humor isn't cruel, it's existential. It's the laugh of someone who's seen the worst and realized it's also kind of ridiculous. There's wisdom in that. A recognition that tragedy without irony is just melodrama, and humans, bless us, are too absurd to ever stay purely tragic. That blend of sorrow and laughter is what makes Spanish culture so hypnotic. You can feel it in the way they celebrate death during Dia de los Difuntos, not as an end, but as a reunion. Or in flamenco, where a single voice can sound like both prayer and rebellion. That's not denial, it's defiance. It's the refusal to let pain have the final word. The sailor's legacy, in that sense, wasn't the disease itself, but the resilience that followed it. They taught the world that survival is not the absence of suffering, but the ability to sing through it. It's strange how much of our modern world still moves to that same rhythm. We think we're so advanced, but emotionally, we're still out at sea, trying to make sense of our wounds with whatever music we can find. The sailors had sea shanties. We have playlists. Their isolation lasted months. Ours lasts a lifetime, one notification at a time. But both come from the same ache, the need to feel close to something real before it's too late. Maybe that's what made those men both tragic and divine. They were willing to risk everything for the unknown. They didn't have the luxury of cynicism. They couldn't Google what waited beyond the horizon. They had to find out the hard way. And that's what makes them so haunting. They remind us that certainty is a modern addiction. We've traded wonder for Wi-Fi, adventure for convenience. If someone told those sailors that one day people would travel the world without ever leaving their couch, they'd probably laugh and then cry a little for us. But even as the centuries pass, something about their fever lingers. You can feel it in every act of curiosity, every rebellion against comfort. It's the same force that pushes people to write novels no one will read, to start revolutions that will fail, to fall in love knowing it might end badly. It's irrational, inconvenient, and entirely necessary. It's the fever of being human, the refusal to stop reaching even when reaching burns. And that's why their story still matters. Because buried beneath the maps, the gold, the epidemics, and the guilt lies a truth so simple it's almost embarrassing. Every great discovery begins as a mistake. The sailors didn't mean to change the world. They were just looking for spices and salvation. But in their failure, they created a new kind of world, one where borders blurred and everything touched everything else. That's the irony of contagion. It unites before it destroys. And maybe that's why we keep romanticizing them. Because in some secret corner of our modern hearts, we envy their clarity. They knew what they feared, what they wanted, what they were willing to lose. We, on the other hand, get lost scrolling through choices we don't even care about. The sailors died of infection. We die of indecision. But both deaths ask the same question. What does it mean to live fully when every choice carries risk? Maybe the only answer worth giving is the one they lived by. To keep sailing. To embrace the fever instead of fearing it. To touch the world knowing it will touch you back. Painfully, beautifully, irrevocably. Because in the end, that's the only cure we've ever found. For the disease of being human is also its own medicine. And no matter how many centuries pass, the ocean of that truth never really dries. It just waits for someone foolish enough or brave enough to set sail again. The ocean has a strange sense of humor. It gives and it takes in equal measure, and it never explains itself. The Spanish sailors learned that the hard way. One moment they were gods of the horizon, and the next they were coughing blood into their beards, realizing that nature doesn't care how holy your flag is. It's almost poetic in a darkly comic way. Men who believed they were carrying divine purpose ended up spreading something far more democratic: disease. The universe always balances the ego, usually with irony. What they didn't realize was that the real infection wasn't in their blood. It was in their minds. The fever of superiority, the idea that discovery meant ownership, that God himself had signed off on their ambitions. And isn't that the same fever that still burns in us? We call it innovation now. We dress it up with buzzwords and PowerPoints, but the symptom is identical. The belief that because we can, we should. The Spanish built ships. We build algorithms. They conquered continents. We conquer attention spans. And somehow we still end up sick. It's almost comforting to see how consistent humanity is in its contradictions. We crave progress, but mourn what it destroys. We invent cures that create new diseases. The sailors thought they were bringing civilization to chaos. We think we're bringing connectivity to isolation. And yet, the more connected we become, the lonelier we feel. Maybe that's the modern version of the sailor's plague, not of the body, but of the soul. We've replaced sores with scrolling. The symptoms are just digital now: restless fingers, sleepless nights, phantom vibrations that feel a little like guilt. There's a peculiar symmetry in how the sea and the internet mirror each other. Both are vast, mysterious, and full of things you probably shouldn't touch. The sailors looked at the horizon and thought, there must be something out there worth dying for. We stare at our screens thinking the same thing. Somewhere, surely there's meaning, or at least a good deal. The explorers had compasses, we have algorithms, and both often lead us in circles. It's funny in a tragic way, how every generation keeps mistaking movement for direction. But maybe that's what makes us human. The sailors weren't evil, they were curious. Curiosity has always been our favorite sin, the one we never repent for. It's what drove them across oceans and drives us across ideas. And curiosity, like disease, spreads without permission. Once it starts, you can't contain it. The difference is that curiosity doesn't rot flesh. It burns illusions, and that's always painful. The sailors returned from the New World, not just infected, but changed, forced to see that the world was bigger, stranger, and more fragile than they'd been taught. The sickness didn't just kill them, it humbled them. Maybe that's the real lesson hidden in all their suffering, that every discovery, no matter how glorious, comes with a reckoning. The Spaniards brought gold and got guilt in return. They found paradise and realized it had a price. And isn't that true for all of us? Every time we think we've found the answer, life quietly hands us the bill. The cost of knowledge is never printed in advance. Ask any scientist who cured a disease and accidentally created a side effect, or any lover who finally got what they wanted and immediately felt empty. The sailor's plague was physical, but the moral one? Oh, that one still circulates. It's almost beautiful how the world remembers pain better than perfection. The Spanish Empire eventually fell, but its ghosts still travel. You can taste them in Latin America's languages, in the spices that once cost lives, in the architecture that still bleeds history. It's strange, isn't it? The same ships that carried death also carried rhythm, color, and cuisine. Humanity's tragedies always double as recipes. Every empire leaves a flavor behind, a cultural aftertaste that reminds the world of both its cruelty and its creativity. You can see that duality even in the smallest things. Think about chocolate. It was once a sacred drink in the Americas before the Europeans turned it into a luxury commodity. The same seed that symbolized divinity became dessert. That's what we do. We turn meaning into consumption and call it progress. The sailors may have infected the world with disease, but modernity infected it with desire. And between the two, desire is far more difficult to cure. At least fever breaks eventually, but the irony runs even deeper. Those sailors believed that suffering was redemptive, that their pain proved their holiness. Today we just call it hustle culture. The ships are gone, but the theology remains. We glorify exhaustion as if it's a sacrament. The sailor prayed, we grind. Both are acts of faith that if we just endure a little more, paradise, be it heaven or success, will arrive. And it never does. Not really. The finish line keeps moving, the map keeps expanding, and the fever keeps rising. And yet, somewhere between the absurdity and the ache, there's a strange, noble truth. We need the fever. Without it, we'd never move. We'd never dare. The same madness that made the sailors set sail is what makes artists create. Lovers risk heartbreak, and scientists chase impossible answers. The disease of wanting more is also the source of every miracle we've ever made. We just never seem to know when to stop. Humanity's greatest strength and greatest flaw are the same organ beating too fast. You can still feel that heartbeat if you stand near the ocean long enough. The rhythm of the waves feels like memory itself, endless, repetitive, slightly mournful. Every crash against the shore says the same thing the sailors once whispered to the wind. There must be something beyond this, and maybe that's why their story endures. Because we see ourselves in their delirium, in their need to go further, even when further hurts. In the end, their ships decayed, their maps yellowed, their empires collapsed. But the fever they unleashed, the hunger for more, the inability to be satisfied, outlived them all. And we're still sailing those invisible seas, still confusing conquest for understanding, still mistaking progress for peace. Maybe that's not failure. Maybe that's just what it means to be human, to keep touching the fire, to keep coughing up meaning, to keep searching the endless horizon for a cure that doesn't exist. And if we can laugh while we do it, maybe that's salvation enough. It's funny how history pretends to be about progress when most of it is just people making the same mistakes with better shoes. The Spanish sailors thought they were ushering in a new world, and they were, just not the one they imagined. They believed they were God's chosen navigators. In truth, they were accidental couriers of chaos. Yet there's something irresistibly human about that contradiction. Every great act of discovery is also an act of destruction. Every breakthrough leaves a bruise, and every empire, no matter how golden, starts to rust the moment it believes it's immortal. The sailors didn't know it, but they were carrying two very different contagions across the Atlantic, one biological, one psychological. The first was syphilis, the second was ambition. And between the two, ambition turned out to be far deadlier. Disease kills the body. Ambition kills slowly by convincing you that nothing you've done is ever enough. The sailors reached new lands, and instead of awe, they felt hunger. More gold, more power, more salvation, more everything. The tragedy of discovery isn't that it ends, it's that it never does. It's the same instinct that keeps modern people scrolling through their phones at 2 a.m. The sailors chased new horizons. We chase new notifications. Both are symptoms of the same virus, curiosity infected by anxiety. The ocean is infinite, but so is the internet, and both are equally good at reminding us how small we are. We tell ourselves we're exploring, but really, we're drifting, hoping to find meaning in the noise. The sailors thought they'd reached paradise. We think we'll find it on page 2 of Google. And maybe that's why their story still hits so close. Beneath all the history, it's just the oldest human drama, the fear of insignificance. The sailors faced it in the middle of the sea, staring at horizons that looked like eternity. We face it sitting in traffic, staring at our reflections in screens. The setting changed. The feeling didn't. Both are haunted by the same question. What if all of this, every voyage, every empire, every effort, still isn't enough to matter? There's something both hilarious and tragic about that realization. The Spanish explorers conquered half the known world, and today, most people only know them from memes about bad mustaches and colonialism. That's the universe's sense of humor in action. No one escapes irrelevance for long. Even the mightiest end up reduced to punchlines. And yet, humanity keeps trying, keeps building, conquering, performing, as if this time, maybe, we'll outwit oblivion. It's adorable in a doomed sort of way, but that's also what makes us miraculous. The sailors, for all their brutality, were also poets without knowing it. They stared into the unknown and mistook terror for destiny, and in doing so, they invented meaning. Every time humanity pushes beyond what it understands, it does so with a mix of arrogance and awe. That's what gives the story its rhythm, the tension between our smallness and our delusions of grandeur. It's what turns suffering into myth, mistakes into legacy. Even the diseases we spread become metaphors in hindsight. The sailors' fever wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. They infected the world with longing. You can still feel that infection in the way we talk about success. The language hasn't changed much. Discovery, growth, expansion, all euphemisms for the same ancient hunger. We still worship progress like a deity, and we still pretend it's benevolent, but progress doesn't care who it saves or who it breaks. It's just motion. The sailors didn't mean to start an empire. They were following a compass and a dream. The rest, disease, conquest, genocide, was the fine print. Every golden age is a side effect of someone else's fever. And yet, for all the horror, there's no denying the beauty that emerged from the wreckage. Spain's empire rotted, but from its ruins came music, literature, and language that reshaped continents. The same ships that carried death also carried rhythm, flavor, and imagination. Humanity's brilliance has always been its ability to turn infection into art. We can't stop making meaning out of our own decay. Maybe that's what keeps us from extinction, the instinct to find beauty in our mess, to sing about the fire instead of putting it out. Even now, centuries later, the echoes of those voyages ripple through our everyday lives. The globalized world, the languages we speak, the food we eat, the borders we fight over, all trace back to those wooden decks filled with feverish men. The irony is that the sailors thought they were changing the world. They were just setting it in motion. The real transformation happened later when the world started changing them back, because the truth about exploration is that it always cuts both ways. You can't touch the unknown without being touched by it. That's the part we still forget. Every empire believes it's exporting civilization. Every individual believes they're immune to consequence. But everything we touch touches us in return. The Spanish learned that in blood and bone, and we keep relearning it in new ways, through climate change, through burnout, through the quiet realization that every advancement comes with a price tag we can't quite afford. History doesn't punish, it teaches. We just have terrible study habits. Still, there's something profoundly hopeful buried in that repetition. The sailors didn't survive because they were righteous. They survived because they adapted. And adaptation, for all its pain, is humanity's true art form. We've learned to turn every disaster into a lesson, every scar into a story. We carry the ghosts of those voyages in our DNA, not as curses, but as reminders that we are, by nature, unfinished. The same fever that once sent ships across oceans now sends rockets into space. The same desperation that once drove men to conquer now drives us to connect. The direction may be different, but the fire's the same. If you strip away the myths, the sailor's journey was never really about geography. It was about the human condition itself, the refusal to sit still, to look at the vastness of existence and say, there has to be more. It's an instinct so ridiculous and divine that it almost redeems us. Because even if every voyage ends in loss, every discovery tainted by error, every empire doomed to collapse, we keep sailing anyway. Not because we believe the horizon will save us, but because we can't bear not to see what's beyond it. And maybe that's why, centuries later, we still tell their story. Not as a warning, not as a celebration, but as a mirror. We recognize ourselves in those feverish men, terrified, ambitious, broken, brilliant. They were searching for new worlds, and in doing so, they accidentally revealed the oldest one of all, the restless, haunted, beautiful geography of the human soul. And that map, unlike theirs, will never be finished. History is full of people who thought they were writing a triumphant ending, only to discover they were just starting a very long sequel. The Spanish sailors believed they were closing one chapter of the world and opening another, a perfect story of discovery, glory, and divine purpose. Instead, they accidentally wrote the manual for how civilizations infect each other forever. It's beautiful in a twisted way. They were trying to find God, and they ended up finding us. Humanity in all its feverish contradictions, floating somewhere between sainthood and sin. The sea has always been the perfect stage for our delusions of grandeur. It looks infinite enough to make our ambitions feel noble and empty enough to hide the consequences of them. But the sailors didn't just cross water, they crossed meaning itself. The world before them was vast and unknowable. After them, it became measurable, conquerable, marketable. And isn't that the story of progress in a nutshell? And we take what is mysterious, dissect it, label it, and sell it back to ourselves in smaller, shinier pieces. Wonder becomes product. The unknown becomes a business plan. You can almost picture it. A deck full of sunburned men staring at a horizon that won't end, believing that what they were doing was divine destiny. And maybe it was, just not in the way they imagined. They didn't realize that the diseases in their blood, the stories in their heads, and the greed in their hearts would blend into something far more contagious than syphilis, the mythology of control. They brought to the world the idea that everything could be claimed, cataloged, and cleansed of mystery. It was the birth of what we now call civilization, and the start of an obsession that still burns feverishly today. It's easy to mock them now, but we're not that different. We've just swapped maps for algorithms. Instead of drawing borders on land, we draw them in data. Instead of chasing spices, we chase attention. We still believe that the world is ours to improve, optimize, and monetize. The Spanish priests sprinkled holy water over their empires. We sprinkle Wi-Fi. The ritual hasn't changed, only the vocabulary. Progress, purpose, innovation. They're just the modern versions of glory, salvation, conquest. The fever mutates, but the body stays the same. There's something deeply funny, in a cosmic sort of way, about how humanity keeps mistaking expansion for enlightenment. The sailors believed that finding new worlds would make them whole. We think buying new things will do the same, but every discovery just opens another void. You cross one ocean and find 10 more. You solve one problem and invent 5 others. It's like trying to cure loneliness by throwing a parade. You just end up with louder loneliness. The sailors didn't bring home peace. They brought gold and guilt. We don't bring home wisdom. We bring receipts. And yet, it's impossible not to admire the madness of it. The same fever that makes us destroy also makes us create. Without it, there would be no art, no music, no science, no stories like this one. The sailors' voyages were terrible and magnificent because they exposed the double helix of human nature, cruelty and curiosity intertwined. Every empire begins with awe and ends with exhaustion, but between those 2 points lies everything we call culture. That's the real legacy of Spain. Not the ships, or the gold, or the colonies, but the art of transforming catastrophe into beauty. You can still see that transformation vibrating through Spanish history. After the empire fell, the people didn't bury their pain. They danced it, painted it, sang it. Duende, that untranslatable word that means soul mixed with struggle, was born from that inheritance. It's the sound of centuries refusing to die quietly. It's the echo of every sailor's scream, every sinner's prayer, every confession whispered to the sea. In a way, duenda is the cure the sailors never found, a fever that doesn't kill but awakens. It's almost as if Spain realized, long before the rest of the world, that suffering is inevitable, but meaning is optional. You don't get to choose the storms, but you do get to decide how you dance through them. That's why Spanish tragedy feels different. It's never about despair, but defiance. Even death gets treated like a dinner guest. The Spanish laugh with their ghosts because they've been sharing a table for centuries. Maybe that's why their culture feels so alive. It's built on the bones of people who refuse to be forgotten. And if you think about it, that's all any of us are really trying to do, to leave behind something that outlives the fever. The sailors left maps, monuments, and myths. We leave digital footprints, posts, and pixels. Both are desperate attempts to be remembered by a world that keeps forgetting. But memory, like the sea, doesn't obey anyone. It erases and reshapes at will. The sailors thought they'd be immortal. Instead, their names dissolved and their consequences remained. That's how history works. It forgets the actors but never the act. Maybe that's why we're so obsessed with legacy. Deep down, we know how temporary everything is. The sailors faced that truth every time they saw a storm on the horizon. We face it every time we realize our battery's at 1%. Mortality used to be measured in cannon fire. Now it's measured in screen time. The scale has changed, but the dread hasn't. We're all still trying to make peace with the fact that the world moves on without us. The only difference is that the sailors didn't have social media to fake meaning with. But perhaps that's where they had the advantage. Their chaos was honest. They didn't pretend to be balanced, mindful, or at peace. They embraced the fever, the delirium, the contradiction of being alive. They sinned loudly, prayed louder, and died knowing that at least they burned brightly while they lasted. We, on the other hand, suffer quietly behind curated smiles, terrified of mess. Maybe that's why our art feels so sterile sometimes. It's too clean to be human. Spain's art, born from rot and glory, still breathes because it never forgot how to sweat. And that's what makes this story eternal. It's not really about sailors or ships or diseases. It's about the fever that built the modern world. The need to touch, to reach, to claim, to confess. The same fever that made those men set sail centuries ago is still pulsing in us every time we create, destroy, or fall in love. The sea they crossed still lives inside us, a restless blue ache that whispers, "Go further." We never really left the port. We just changed our vessels. And maybe that's the cruelest and most beautiful truth of all. Humanity never recovers from its own hunger. It just learns how to sail better storms. The ocean has always been the most honest mirror humanity ever faced. It reflects nothing but the truth. Vastness, uncertainty, and the quiet reminder that control is an illusion. The Spanish sailors looked into that mirror every morning, trying to convince themselves that courage was stronger than fear. But the ocean never lies. It swallows both the brave and the arrogant in the same breath. And maybe that's why it still fascinates us. Deep down, we all suspect the sea knows something about us that we're afraid to admit. Those sailors, drenched in salt and superstition, weren't just battling waves, they were battling their own illusions. Every sunrise brought a new argument with God. Every sunset, another with themselves. Imagine it. The smell of sweat and gunpowder, the endless creak of the ship, the sound of prayers mixed with curses. One man coughing blood in the corner while another swears he saw a mermaid that looked suspiciously like regret. The voyage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They were floating laboratories of the human condition. Greed, faith, guilt, hope, all fermenting in the same wooden barrel. The funny thing is, the sea always wins, but it never gloats. It just waits. It lets people believe they're in charge until the wind shifts, the compass breaks, or the hull leaks. Then it reminds them who's boss. There's a lesson there, not just about nature, but about existence itself. We spend our lives charting maps, making plans, pretending to steer the ship, while deep down we know the current decides everything. The sailors thought they were discovering the world. The world was just rearranging them. And maybe that's the part of their story that feels so modern. The sailors thought they were pioneering. In truth, they were improvising. They didn't have manuals or GPS, just rumors and instinct. Isn't that what all of us are doing? Pretending we have a plan while secretly hoping no one notices we're just making it up as we go. We call it strategy. They called it faith. It's the same thing, trusting that if we keep moving forward, something meaningful will appear. Of course, not everything that appeared was divine. The diseases that crept through their ships were invisible sermons, lessons written in fever and blisters. Some men thought they were being punished for lust. Others believed they were chosen to suffer. Either way, the infection became a language of revelation. Every symptom whispered, "You are not in control." It's strange how pain teaches clarity faster than philosophy ever can. You don't need theology when your body is a cathedral collapsing in slow motion. But here's the paradox. Even as they decayed, they created. The sailors wrote songs, carved saints into wood, and confessed sins that even priests would blush to hear. They found a way to make beauty out of agony, as if to prove that suffering wasn't the end, but the beginning of understanding. There's something almost sacred about that instinct, to take chaos and sculpt it into meaning. It's what separates us from the sea. The ocean just swallows, we translate. And translation, it turns out, is the heart of civilization. The sailors brought back not just gold and disease, but stories, myths from the New World that made Europe question what it thought it knew. Every tale of distant jungles and gods turned into fuel for imagination. Pain became poetry. Guilt became culture. You can trace entire art movements back to the echoes of those voyages. The irony is that some of the most beautiful expressions of humanity were born from its ugliest moments. That's how we work. We metabolize tragedy into elegance, sin into song. Even the diseases had their own strange legacy. Syphilis didn't just infect bodies, it infected philosophy. It haunted artists and thinkers for centuries. Nietzsche's madness, Schubert's despair, Baudelaire's decadence, all bore the ghost of that ancient fever. It's unsettling and fascinating that an illness carried by desperate sailors could ripple through time and shape the very tone of modern thought. The sickness became a metaphor. Beauty rotting from within, pleasure punished by decay, genius tied to destruction. You could almost say the Renaissance had a rash, and yet we keep repeating the same pattern. Every age has its epidemic of meaning. The sailors had syphilis, we have self-awareness. Their flesh burned with infection, ours burns with overthinking. Both make you sweat at night. The sailors search the horizon for salvation, we search therapy apps. The only real difference is that they believed confession could save them, while we believe introspection will. Neither one works completely, but both make the journey bearable. It's easy to laugh at their superstition, but let's be honest, ours isn't that different. They believe storms were divine punishment. We believe Mercury in retrograde is ruining our Wi-Fi. They sprinkled holy water. We burned sage. Everyone's just trying to negotiate with chaos. It's comforting to pretend the universe can be bribed into being kind. But the truth, the one the ocean keeps whispering, is that control is an illusion, and meaning is a choice. That's the strange mercy of it all. The sailors died believing their voyage was holy, and maybe it was, not because they found paradise, but because they found perspective. They learned the most terrifying and liberating truth there is. The world doesn't owe us coherence. Everything, faith, pain, joy, decay, is just motion. We make the story, we name the disease, we decide what the storm means. The sea doesn't care either way, and somehow that indifference is freeing, because once you stop begging the universe for answers, you start hearing its laughter instead. The same low, endless rumble of the waves. The sailors mistook it for thunder, but maybe it was amusement. Maybe the ocean was laughing at how seriously humans take themselves. And maybe it still is. Every time we launch rockets into space, colonize a new digital frontier, or chase another illusion of control, the cosmos must look down and think, how adorable, they're still at it. That's the true inheritance of those voyages. Not conquest, not maps, not riches, but the eternal absurdity of human striving. And we keep touching the unknown, not because it will save us, but because we can't help it. The fever that drove those sailors across the ocean never burned out. It just changed shape. It's in every risk we take, every story we tell, every hope we refuse to abandon. And that's why their ghosts still sail with us. Not to haunt, but to remind. To whisper that even in the middle of endless uncertainty, even when everything you thought you controlled slips away, there's still wonder left. Because maybe the point was never to reach the other side. Maybe the point was to keep sailing. There's something eerily human about how silence feels louder after the storm. When the last Spanish sails disappeared beyond the horizon, Europe exhaled. Not in peace, but in disbelief. The world had been stretched open, and there was no closing it again. Gold poured in, diseases spread out, and with them came something far more contagious. The idea that nothing was unreachable anymore, and that perhaps was the most dangerous infection of all, the illusion of limitlessness. Every empire since has caught the same fever. Some burned out in centuries, others in decades, but none have found the cure. Imagine standing in Seville in 1520, the air thick with incense and rumor, the markets overflowing with spices from lands people still couldn't quite believe existed, priests preaching gratitude while merchants whispered profit margins. You could almost taste the contradiction. Holy ambition marinated in greed. The sailors had brought back proof that the world was round, but no one seemed to notice that their souls had flattened in the process. It's a pattern that never went away. The moment humanity conquers mystery, it replaces it with consumption. That's why the Spanish story feels so modern. It's not about wooden ships or golden idols. It's about how every generation builds an empire of its own illusions. Back then, they mapped the earth. Now we map ourselves. We measure steps, track sleep, analyze moods, as if data could fill the hole that wonder used to. We no longer fear the edges of the world. We fear the edges of Wi-Fi. The sailors had sextants and rosaries. We have notifications and existential dread. Yet, in both cases, the same question keeps floating beneath the surface. If we conquer everything, what's left to believe in? Perhaps that's why, even at the height of their glory, the Spanish were haunted by melancholy. The poets of the empire wrote about conquest as if it were heartbreak. They spoke of paradise lost, of beauty rotting under gold, of faith corroded by victory. It's as if they sensed that their empire was a mirage, that every coin of gold carried a whisper of sin. Empires always die the same way, not from defeat, but from disillusionment. The body decays long after the soul has given up. The irony is that while Europe glorified these explorers as heroes, the sailors themselves were often broken men, scarred, infected, half mad from salt and fear. They didn't return as triumphant conquerors, but as walking contradictions, revered and ruined, blessed and cursed. Their faces were maps of exhaustion. Many of them died quietly, their names forgotten by the same people who sang hymns to their courage. That's the cruel humor of history. It immortalizes the idea of men, never the men themselves. And yet, there's something profoundly poetic about that. Maybe anonymity is the price of progress. Every time humanity leaps forward, someone gets erased in the process. The hands that built, the voices that prayed, the bodies that broke. The Spanish Empire was built on both faith and fever, and neither one spared its builders. It's strange how civilization keeps demanding human sacrifice. Even after pretending it's outgrown the ritual, we've just made the altars invisible now. But history has a dark sense of irony. The diseases that the sailors carried, once symbols of sin and decay, ended up reshaping medicine, art, and even empathy. The same plague that filled graveyards also filled canvases and poems. Pain became perspective. It's almost as if the world learned compassion through contagion. Every era needs a sickness to remind it that it's still mortal. Ours just happens to be spiritual rather than biological. It's hard not to draw parallels. The sailors spread syphilis, we spread burnout. Their wounds were visible. Ours glow behind blue light. They died from fevers. We live with them. Our age has its own version of those delirious voyages. Corporate ladders instead of oceans. Ambition instead of wind. Anxiety instead of storms. We still chase unreachable horizons, convinced that happiness is just one discovery, one promotion, one new continent away. And when we arrive, we're just as lost as they were. But maybe the real voyage was never about finding paradise. It was about realizing we carry it and ruin it wherever we go. The sailors didn't bring evil to the New World. They brought themselves. The disease wasn't just in their blood. It was in their worldview, in their hunger to possess rather than understand. And that same hunger hums quietly inside all of us. Every time we mistake owning something for knowing it, we resurrect that same fever. Every time we value dominance over connection, the plague sails again. There's an odd comfort in that realization, though, because if the sickness is human, then so is the cure. The sailors didn't know how to stop spreading disease, but they knew how to sing through it. Their chants, their laughter, their superstitions. They were primitive acts of resilience. They didn't have antibiotics, but they had stories. And in a world obsessed with productivity and progress, maybe that's what we've lost. The ability to survive through storytelling instead of strategy. Think about it. Every culture born from those colonial collisions learned to turn pain into poetry. From the fusion of Spanish hymns and indigenous drums came new rhythms, new languages, new identities. The empire rotted, but art bloomed in the cracks. That's the paradox of human history. We ruin everything we touch, yet somehow beauty keeps growing out of the wreckage. It's almost as if the universe forgives us through creativity. And perhaps that's the quiet redemption at the heart of all this. The sailors didn't die in vain if their suffering became song, if their failures became metaphors, if their fever became fuel for future generations to ask better questions. The ocean didn't drown them to punish, it baptized them into meaning. Every wave that carried them away carried their stories forward too. So when we look at their legacy, not just the gold or the graves, but the art, the language, the echoes, we're really looking at ourselves. We are the continuation of their fever, their foolishness, and their faith. The sea they crossed is the same one we're still trying to navigate, the one inside us. And every time we set out chasing perfection, we hear that same whisper the sailors once did. You'll never reach the end of the world because the world doesn't end. It just changes shape. Maybe that's the true moral of their journey. We keep sailing, not because we expect to find paradise, but because the act of seeking is what keeps us alive. The horizon isn't a destination. It's a mirror, showing us what we've become. And as long as we keep looking toward it, maybe there's still hope that one day we'll learn how to cross it without carrying the plague of ourselves. It's strange how history always ends with silence. After the last cannon echoes fade, after the last map is drawn, after the last explorer dies clutching a rosary, there's only quiet. And in that quiet, the truth becomes louder than ever. The Spanish sailors thought they were writing the world's grandest story, but what they really wrote was a confession. Every empire is just that, a long, eloquent apology disguised as glory. The seas they crossed, the lands they claimed, the lives they consumed, all of it was an attempt to escape the unbearable awareness that they were mortal. Gold was never the goal. Forgetting was. You can almost feel it in their diaries, the way their handwriting changes over time, from proud to trembling, from bold to broken. Early pages are filled with prayers for victory, later ones with prayers for peace. It's a pattern that never dies out. We start every pursuit believing it'll make us infinite, and we end it realizing it only made us tired. The Spanish Empire was the same, a brilliant fever that mistook burning for shining. They believed they were chosen to illuminate the world, not realizing that light blinds as easily as it guides. But even in their blindness, there's something deeply human. You can't help but admire their audacity, the sheer cosmic arrogance it takes to stand on a wooden deck, point at a horizon you don't understand, and say, "That's mine." Humanity's greatest sin and greatest art form have always been the same, claiming ownership over mystery. And yet, if you peel away the ego, you see the deeper truth. They weren't trying to own the world, they were trying to understand it. The tragedy is that they didn't know the difference. The confusion still defines us. We've traded oceans for networks, ships for servers, but the instinct hasn't changed. The explorers of today wear suits instead of armor, launch satellites instead of sails, but the same fever drives them. It's no longer about crossing seas. It's about crossing limits, biological, technological, moral. We still believe there's something waiting on the other side of more. We call it progress, but sometimes it feels like an elegant form of self-destruction. The sailors burned forests for gold. We burn time for validation. Different tools, same delusion. And yet, it's impossible not to root for us. For all our chaos, we keep trying. The same stubborn hope that sent men into storms now sends us into the unknown corners of our own minds. The sailors risked their lives chasing new worlds. We risk our sanity chasing meaning. We build cathedrals, then therapy apps. We pray, then post. Maybe evolution isn't about becoming smarter. It's about finding more creative ways to cope with the same questions. If you think about it, the Spanish didn't just export goods and religion. They exported emotion, melancholy, guilt, the poetry of loss. Even their victories sounded like dirges. That's the inheritance of every empire. Not land, but mood. You can still feel it today in the way Latin cultures celebrate tragedy, turning sorrow into song, heartbreak into dance. That's the alchemy of survival, transforming pain into rhythm so you can bear its weight. The sailors may have brought suffering, but their descendants taught the world how to sing through it. And isn't that the ultimate paradox? That destruction and beauty are never really opposites, just stages in the same cycle. The ships that carried disease also carried language, color, rhythm, taste. Out of the infection came fusion. Out of despair, art. Maybe that's what history really is, a long, painful collaboration between cruelty and creativity. The Spanish believed they were saving souls. In the end, they accidentally saved stories. It's funny how every era believes it's the climax of civilization. The sailors thought they'd reached the end of the world. We think we've reached the peak of understanding. Both are wrong. Every time we think we've arrived, the horizon moves. The world is a master of irony. It lets us believe we're in control just long enough to make our collapse interesting. And maybe that's mercy, in its own dark way. The fall hurts less when it feels like a plot twist. There's a lesson hidden in the sailors' silence. When they returned home, many of them didn't talk about what they'd seen. Maybe it was guilt, maybe awe, or maybe they realized that some experiences are too heavy for language. They'd looked into the raw, unfiltered face of the world and realized that human vocabulary wasn't built for that kind of truth. You can't describe infinity without breaking it. You can't possess wonder without corrupting it. All you can do is live it, lose it, and try not to forget the feeling. And yet, forgetting is what we're best at. The same civilization that crossed oceans eventually forgot why it started sailing. The empires rotted, their maps faded, their gods went quiet, but the hunger remained. It hides in our inventions, our obsessions, our art. We still dream of conquest, only now we call it self-improvement. We explore galaxies not out of need, but out of restlessness. There's a kind of comedy in that, humanity, forever dissatisfied, forever pretending that the next discovery will finally fill the hole that existence carved into us. Spoiler, it won't. But maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe the point was never to find meaning, but to keep creating it. The sailors' greatest legacy wasn't the empire, it was the endurance of wonder. The same curiosity that infected them now infects us. It's the fever that built civilizations, composed symphonies, cured diseases, painted skies. It's also the fever that burned cities, broke hearts, and drowned dreams. But it's the reason we're still here, still asking questions, still daring to believe that somewhere beyond the horizon, something extraordinary waits. Perhaps that's what redemption really looks like. Not a grand apology, but a quiet persistence. The Spanish sailors, for all their sins, taught the world to move, to seek, to risk, to live like answers might exist even if they don't. Every voyage, every heartbreak, every failed empire was just another way of saying, we tried. And that's the most human sentence ever written. So when you think of them, those feverish men chasing gold and God, don't picture villains or heroes. Picture mirrors. because their story isn't over. It sails in our bloodstream, hums in our machines, burns in our ambitions. The ships are gone, but the hunger remains, disguised as progress, disguised as hope. The ocean they crossed is now inside us, endless, unpredictable, alive. And maybe that's where the real discovery happened. Because in the end, the sailors didn't just find new worlds, they revealed what kind of creatures we really are. Beautiful, broken, desperate to matter. Endlessly capable of turning our worst mistakes into meaning. And if that's not proof that the human spirit is both a tragedy and a miracle, then maybe the ocean still has one more secret left to tell.